A 7-year-old girl stood in a freezing biker garage surrounded by scarred men with prison tattoos and combat nightmares, and she was the only one who heard the breathing behind the locked door. What they found on the other side wasn't a burglar. It was a laptop filled with surveillance photos of their children, their wives, their homes. Someone had been watching them for weeks. And the man crouching in the shadows? He wasn't working alone. Before that night ended, the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club would discover a conspiracy designed to destroy them from the inside out. And the only person who saw it coming was a child no one had ever listened to. If this story hooks you, stay until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The rain came sideways that February evening, cold enough to sting bare skin, hard enough to blur the neon glow leaking through the garage windows of the Iron Saints compound on the outskirts of Harlan Falls, Ohio. It was a nothing town. Dead steel mills, boarded storefronts, a single traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 p.m. The kind of place America forgot about 30 years ago and never looked back. But the Iron Saints hadn't forgotten it. They'd claimed it, not with violence or territory markers spray-painted on underpasses, but with presence. The low growl of straight-pipe Harleys through the main drag every Thursday. The smell of engine grease drifting from the open bay doors of a cinder-block building that used to be a transmission shop before the last owner drank himself into foreclosure. Inside, the garage hummed with the rituals of men who had nowhere else to go and no reason to pretend otherwise. A space heater glowed orange in the corner, barely denting the cold. Coffee percolated in a machine so old the handle was held together with electrical tape. Cigarette smoke drifted toward the ceiling in lazy spirals, mixing with the sharper bite of WD-40 and old motor oil. 7 bikes sat in various states of repair along the far wall. Shovelheads, panheads, one rusted Sportster that nobody claimed but everyone worked on when they needed to think. And in the back booth, cross-legged on a cracked vinyl seat with a battered sketchbook balanced on her knees, sat Nora Vale. 7 years old. Brown hair cut short and uneven because Rose, her mother, couldn't afford a real haircut, and did it herself with kitchen scissors every 6 weeks. Quiet in a way that made adults uncomfortable. Not shy. Watchful. She studied rooms the way old soldiers studied tree lines. Her eyes moved before her head did. She colored wolves almost exclusively, filling page after page with dark fur and pale eyes. And she never colored inside the lines because she said the wolves didn't live inside lines either. Nobody in the Iron Saints questioned why a 7-year-old spent 3 nights a week in a motorcycle garage. In Harlan Falls, you didn't ask questions about other people's arrangements. You just made room. Rose Vale worked the closing shift at a truck stop diner 11 miles outside town, and her options for childcare were exactly 0. No family nearby. No money for a sitter. The county's after-school program had been defunded 2 years earlier when the township went bankrupt. Social services had a 14-month waiting list for subsidized care, and the one time Rose called to follow up, the woman on the phone told her to explore community options, and hung up before Rose could explain that she'd already explored every option that existed. So the Iron Saints became the option. It started with Lucas Creed, the club's medic, 39 years old, built like a fence post wrapped in leather, with a surgical scar running from his left ear to his collarbone where a piece of Iraqi shrapnel had tried to open his throat in Fallujah. He'd met Rose at the diner. She'd poured his coffee without small talk, which he appreciated, and he'd left a $20 tip on a $4 check, which she didn't mention. Over months of silence and coffee refills, a quiet understanding formed. Not romance. Something rougher and more honest than that. Recognition. 2 people who had been ground down by systems that were supposed to protect them and had learned to stop expecting protection from anyone. Lucas told Miller Kane about Rose's situation on a Tuesday night while they rebuilt the carburetor on Miller's 72 Electra Glide. Miller listened without interrupting, a skill he'd perfected over 23 years as club president, 6 of which were spent inside the walls of Mansfield Correctional on an aggravated assault charge he still insisted was self-defense. Miller was 61 now, silver streaking through his beard, prison tattoos fading on his knuckles, reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead because he refused to admit he needed them. He had a voice like gravel poured over broken glass, and he used it sparingly. Bring the kid, Miller said when Lucas finished explaining. She's quiet, Lucas added like a warning. Good. Loud kids make me nervous. That was 8 months ago. Since then, Nora had become a fixture, invisible to outsiders, essential to the men inside. She sat in her booth, she colored, she ate whatever someone put in front of her without complaint. Occasionally, she walked up to one of the bikers and said something so perceptive it made the room go still. Once she told Jojo Baines, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a 6'4" former Marine with knuckle tattoos and a voice that could rattle windows, that he looked sad today, but a different sad than yesterday. Jojo had stared at her for 10 seconds, then walked outside and sat on the curb for 20 minutes. Nobody followed him. Nobody asked. That was how things worked inside the Iron Saints. You carried your damage quietly, and when it got too heavy, someone stood near you without making it a conversation. On this particular February night, the rain had been falling for 6 hours straight. The temperature had dropped below 20. Wind rattled the corrugated metal walls of the garage and made the overhead lights swing on their chains, casting shadows that shifted like living things. 8 members were present: Miller, Lucas, Jojo, plus 5 others scattered around the space in various postures of exhaustion and restlessness. The mood was flat. Winter in Harlan Falls did that to people. It pressed down on you like a physical weight, made everything gray and slow and heavy, with the particular misery of places that knew they'd been abandoned. Nora was coloring a wolf with yellow eyes when she heard it. Not the rain, not the wind, not the engines cooling on the other side of the wall. Something underneath all of that, rhythmic, barely audible, coming from the storage room behind the main garage. The room they used for overflow parts and old furniture and boxes of rally t-shirts from years nobody remembered anymore. Breathing, slow, controlled. The kind of breathing someone does when they're trying very hard not to be heard. Nora's hand stopped moving. The brown crayon hovered a 1/4 inch above the page. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she listened the way Lucas had once told her soldiers listen. Not for the sound itself, but for the shape of the silence around it. The jukebox in the corner was playing something with steel guitar. 2 bikers were arguing about a carburetor jet size. Jojo was laughing at something on his phone, a rare sound that usually meant someone had sent him a video of a dog doing something stupid. Normal sounds. But behind them, threading through the gaps like cold air through a cracked window, was that breathing. Nora set down her crayon. She slid off the booth seat. Her boots, second-hand, a half size too big, stuffed with newspaper in the toes, touching the stained concrete floor without sound. She walked across the garage with the deliberate quiet of a child who had learned very young that being small and silent was a survival skill, not a personality trait. She reached Lucas, who was sitting on an overturned milk crate cleaning a socket wrench, and tugged his sleeve. He looked down. Her face was calm, but her eyes were doing the thing. That rapid, precise scanning that always made his stomach clench because it reminded him too much of how his niece used to look before she disappeared. Before the world proved that no amount of watching could keep you safe if the people around you refused to see what you were seeing. "Don't open that door," Nora whispered. Lucas felt something seize in his chest. Not fear exactly, something older, the kind of instinct that predates language, that lives in the base of the skull where the animal brain still watches for predators. He'd felt it in Fallujah, seconds before an IED turned the road into a crater. He'd felt it the night his sister called to say Emma was missing. It was the feeling of time folding, past and present, collapsing into a single razor-thin moment where everything depended on what you did next. He didn't question her. He didn't ask what she heard. He set down the wrench, stood slowly, and caught Miller's eye across the garage. Miller read Lucas's face in half a second. 23 years of running a club built on damaged men and borrowed time had given Miller Kane an almost supernatural ability to read rooms. He could feel a fight coming before the first word was spoken. He could sense a lie in the way someone shifted their weight. And right now, looking at Lucas Creed standing beside a 7-year-old girl who never spoke unless something mattered, Miller felt the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees. He held up one hand. The garage went quiet in layers. First, the argument about carburetor jets stopped. Then the wrench sounds. Then Jojo looked up from his phone, and finally someone killed the jukebox. The silence that followed was thick and watchful. Miller crossed the room. His boots were loud on the concrete. He never tried to be quiet because he believed silence was a tool for younger men, and his job was to be seen coming. "What is it?" he said. Not a question, a demand. Lucas tilted his head toward the storage room door. "Kid heard something." Miller looked at Nora. She stared back at him with those ancient, unsettling eyes and said nothing. She didn't need to. Her stillness said everything. Miller nodded once, then turned to Jojo. "Flashlights. Wake everyone up." Within 90 seconds, the Iron Saints had transformed. Not into soldiers, they'd never been that organized or that clean. Into something more primal. Men who had survived wars, prison yards, addiction, poverty, and the slow grinding violence of being forgotten by every institution that was supposed to care about them. They moved with the coordinated instinct of a pack that had been threatened before and remembered what it cost to hesitate. Jojo positioned himself by the storage room door, one massive hand flat against the metal. Two others flanked him. Briggs, a wiry former addict with steady hands and a felony record that kept him unemployable everywhere except the Saints' garage, and Coyle, a quiet Appalachian transplant who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and hadn't slept through a full night since 2011. Lucas moved Nora behind him. She went without protest, pressing her back against the cold wall, sketchbook clutched to her chest like a shield. Miller stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, eyes locked on the door. "Open it," he said. Jojo pulled the door back in one fast motion, and 3 flashlight beams stabbed into the darkness. The storage room was 10 by 15 feet, crammed with metal shelving units loaded with engine parts, old rally banners, and boxes of junk accumulated over 2 decades of club history. The air smelled like mildew and rust and something else. Something chemical and faintly sweet that didn't belong. They swept the beams left and right. Nothing, just shadows and dust and the faint drip of rainwater through a crack in the ceiling. Then Briggs angled his flashlight down beneath the lowest shelf on the far wall and froze. A man, curled into a space barely large enough for a dog. Gray coveralls, work boots with dried mud caked into the treads, one hand gripping a crowbar so tightly the knuckles had gone white, the other hand resting on a half-open laptop, its screen casting a pale blue glow against the underside of the shelf. The man's eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal caught on a highway at night, wide, calculating, terrified. "Don't move," Jojo said, and his voice carried the specific gravity of a man who had once held a dying friend's head in both hands and kept talking to him until the medics arrived, and who understood that control, real control, was not about volume, but about the absolute certainty that you meant every word. The man didn't move. They pulled him out. Not gently. Coyle grabbed the crowbar and Briggs took the laptop, and Jojo hauled the man to his feet by the collar of his coveralls with the casual efficiency of someone who had handled uncooperative bodies in far worse conditions. Miller approached the laptop. He flipped it open on the workbench under the harsh fluorescent light and started scrolling. The garage went quiet again. But this silence was different. This silence had teeth. The laptop contained photographs, dozens of them, high resolution, taken with a telephoto lens, time-stamped across the last 3 weeks, children walking out of Harlan Falls Elementary School, wives loading groceries into trucks at the Save-A-Lot on Route 9, license plates, home addresses scrawled in a text file, daily routines documented in clinical detail. Subject B leaves for work at 6:45 a.m. Child walks to bus stop alone at 7:20 a.m. No visible security, nearest neighbor 200 yards. Miller's jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. He scrolled further. More photos. More addresses. A folder labeled Timeline containing what appeared to be a staged sequence of events. Fake messages drafted to look like they came from Iron Saints members, doctored images showing bikers in threatening poses near schools, fabricated police reports waiting to be filed. This wasn't surveillance. It was architecture. Someone was building a machine designed to make the Iron Saints look like predators, and then to unleash that narrative on law enforcement, media, and rival clubs simultaneously. Miller recognized the handwriting in the notes. The particular abbreviations, the way certain words were capitalized for emphasis, a habit so specific it was practically a signature. Denny Ross. The name hit the room like a dropped wrench in a cathedral. Miller said it aloud and watched the faces around him change. Some went hard, some went pale, and Jojo's expression didn't change at all, which was worse because it meant he'd already moved past anger into the cold operational space where the most dangerous decisions get made. Denny Ross had been a member of the Iron Saints for 11 years before Miller expelled him 4 years ago. The reasons were never discussed openly, even inside the club. What the younger members knew was that Denny had crossed a line that Miller wouldn't specify, and that the expulsion had been immediate, total, and permanent. What the older members knew, the ones who'd been there, was that Denny had been skimming from the club's legitimate repair business to fund a side operation that involved moving stolen motorcycle parts across state lines, using routes that passed directly through neighborhoods where the Saints' families lived. When Miller confronted him, Denny hadn't denied it. He'd smiled and said, "Everyone's got a price, old man. You just haven't found yours yet." Miller broke his hand hitting Denny that night. 3 metacarpals. He never got it properly set, and on cold mornings the knuckles still locked up, and he had to run them under hot water for 10 minutes before he could grip a coffee cup. Now Denny was back. Not in person. Worse. In strategy. He'd sent an operative into their garage, into the space where a 7-year-old girl sat coloring wolves, and he'd done it with the patience and precision of someone who had been planning this for years. Lucas stood at the edge of the workbench, staring at the laptop screen. His face had gone the color of old concrete. His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, but from the specific physiological response of a man whose trauma had just been triggered so precisely it felt intentional. Because among the dozens of surveillance photos, there was one that stopped his breathing. Nora. Alone. Standing near the monkey bars at Harlan Falls Elementary during recess. Shot from across the street with a telephoto lens. Time-stamped 4 days ago. The composition was deliberate. The framing isolated her from the other children, made her look vulnerable, exposed, forgotten. It was the kind of photograph designed to communicate one thing. We can reach her whenever we want. Lucas's vision narrowed to a point. The edges of the garage disappeared. Sound dropped away. He was back in his sister's kitchen 6 years ago, staring at a school photo of Emma taped to the refrigerator while his sister sobbed into the phone, begging a 911 dispatcher to take her seriously about a man she'd seen following her daughter. The dispatcher had transferred her. The detective assigned to the case had taken 3 days to return the call. By then, Emma was gone. They found her backpack in a drainage ditch off Interstate 71 2 weeks later. They never found Emma. The guilt had eaten Lucas alive for 6 years. Not guilt over what he'd done, guilt over what he hadn't. He'd been deployed when his sister first called about the man near Emma's school. He'd told her to call the police. He'd trusted the system. He'd believed that someone, somewhere in one of the institutions built specifically to protect children, would do their job. Nobody did. And now he was looking at a photograph of another girl, small, quiet, watchful, alone near a playground. And the systems that were supposed to protect her had already failed. The school hadn't noticed a man photographing students from across the street. The police in Harlan Falls consisted of 3 officers covering 400 square miles of rural Ohio, and their response time to the elementary school was 22 minutes on a good day. Social services had already proven they couldn't return a phone call within 14 months. Lucas looked at Nora, who was still standing against the wall with her sketchbook pressed to her chest, and something inside him shifted. Not broke because it was already broken, more like the jagged pieces rearranged themselves into something harder and more deliberate. Then Nora spoke. "I saw him before," she said quietly. Every head in the garage turned toward her. "Near school, last week. He was sitting in a blue car across from the playground. Same boots." She looked at the man in gray coveralls who was now slumped against the wall with Jojo standing over him like a monument. Same dirty spot on his sleeve, right there, she pointed. The room contracted around that single detail. A 7-year-old had noticed what cameras missed, what teachers ignored, what underfunded police forces couldn't cover. She had registered the threat, cataloged it, and stored it with the preternatural precision of a child who had learned that the world was not safe, and that the only defense was to pay attention to everything, always, without exception. Miller crouched down until he was eye level with Nora. His knees cracked. His back protested. He didn't care. He looked at her the way he looked at his own grandchildren, with the fierce, aching tenderness of a man who had spent his life in violent places and understood exactly how fragile small bodies were. "You did good, kid," he said. Nora didn't smile. She nodded once, a small, serious motion that carried more weight than any words could, and went back to her booth. The captured man's name was Gary Silt. He was 44 from Youngstown, had 2 prior arrests for breaking and entering, and had been working for Denny Ross for approximately 6 months. Under JoJo's silent, immovable pressure, not violence, just proximity, just the promise of consequence radiating from a body that had been trained to deliver it, Gary began talking. Denny's plan was methodical. Phase 1. Gather surveillance on every Iron Saints family. Phase 2. Plant fabricated evidence linking the club to threats against local children in schools. Phase 3. Leak the evidence simultaneously to police, FBI tip lines, local media, and 3 rival motorcycle clubs who already had territorial grievances with the Saints. The goal wasn't a war, it was an annihilation, make the Saints look like predators. Let the system, cops, courts, media, public outrage, do the destroying. Denny wouldn't have to fire a single shot. He'd just light the match and watch institutions burn the club alive. It was brilliant. It was patient. And it was already in motion. Miller listened to every word with his arms crossed and his expression carved from stone. When Gary finished, Miller asked one question. "How many others?" Gary's eyes shifted. His tongue ran across cracked lips. 3, maybe 4. I don't know their names. He keeps us separate. Miller looked at Lucas. Lucas looked at JoJo. JoJo looked at the floor and exhaled slowly through his nose, which was the closest thing to an emotional display anyone had ever seen from him. Then Nora set down her crayon again and walked back to the workbench. She reached underneath, the same bench where the laptop had been found, and pulled something from a gap between the wood and the support bracket, a tiny Bluetooth earpiece, still powered on, a faint green light pulsing steadily against her small palm. Someone had been listening to everything they'd said since they found Gary Silt. The garage fell absolutely silent. Not the watchful silence from before. A new silence. The silence of men who suddenly understood that the walls around them offered no protection, that the threat was not contained, that somewhere out in the freezing February darkness, someone was hearing their voices and adjusting plans accordingly. Miller picked up the earpiece between 2 fingers and held it under the light. Commercial grade. Short range, maybe 200 feet, which meant the listener was close. Maybe in a vehicle in the alley behind the compound, maybe in the abandoned laundromat across the street, maybe closer than that. He set the earpiece on the workbench and looked at his brothers. These damaged, scarred, exhausted men who had built something fragile and necessary in a town that had given them nothing. And he saw in their faces what he felt in his own chest. Not fear, something worse. The understanding that everything they had, this garage, this brotherhood, these quiet acts of protection they performed for people the world had already discarded, could be erased in 48 hours by a man smart enough to weaponize the very institutions that had failed them all. Outside, through the hammering rain, came the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine. Not a Harley. Something lighter, faster. It rolled slowly past the compound, once, twice, then stopped somewhere beyond the edge of the floodlight's reach. Watching. Miller killed the overhead lights. The garage dropped into darkness except for the orange glow of the space heater and the pale blue pulse of the laptop screen. "Nobody leaves," he said. "Nobody calls out. Nobody moves until I say." In the silence that followed, the only sound was Nora Vale turning a page in her sketchbook and continuing to color wolves in the dark. And somewhere out there, beyond the rain and the cold and the reach of any law that had ever protected anyone in Harlan Falls, Denny Ross was listening, and the trap was already closing. Nobody slept. The garage sat in darkness for 3 hours after Miller killed the lights, and in that time the only movements were the slow rotation of cigarette cherries glowing orange in the black, the occasional creak of a boot shifting weight on concrete, and the soft scratch of Nora's crayon across paper. A sound so small and so steady it became the heartbeat of the room. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, then to a thin, bitter snow that hissed against the metal walls like static on a dead radio channel. The motorcycle that had circled the compound was gone, or parked, or waiting somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, which was worse than either. At 4 a.m, Miller finally spoke. "Lucas, Jojo, table." 3 men gathered around the workbench under the dim glow of a single clamp desk lamp that Briggs had rigged to a car battery when the overhead lights went dark. Their faces looked carved from shadow, deep hollows under the eyes, hard lines around mouths that had forgotten how to relax. Gary Silt sat zip-tied to a folding chair in the corner, his chin on his chest, either sleeping or pretending to. The Bluetooth earpiece sat in the center of the table like a dead insect, its green light finally extinguished after Miller had crushed its battery with the heel of his boot an hour earlier. Miller spread the laptop's contents across the table. Printed now, because Coyle had dragged the ancient inkjet printer from the storage room and fed it paper until it choked. Surveillance photos, fabricated messages, a timeline of planned events stretching forward 6 weeks. The scope of Denny Ross's operation lay exposed under the lamplight like a dissected animal, its mechanisms ugly and precise. "He's not coming through the front door," Miller said. His voice was stripped down to its foundation. No gravel performance, no president's authority. Just a tired man stating facts. "He's going to make us open it ourselves." Lucas stared at the timeline. His eyes kept drifting back to the same entry, dated 9 days from now. Phase 3. Media package distributed. Anonymous tips to FBI field office, Columbus PD, Channel 4 investigative desk, and Ohio chapters of the Savage Kings, Dead Circuit, and Hollow Men, MCS. Below it, in Denny's cramped handwriting, "Saints react. Let them. Every punch thrown is a headline." "He wants us angry," Lucas said. "He wants us stupid," Miller corrected. Jojo hadn't spoken yet. He stood with his arms folded across his massive chest, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall, processing information the way he always did. Silently. Completely. With a patience that most people mistook for slowness and only understood was something else entirely when he finally moved. When Jojo moved, nothing was wasted. "Who's the leak?" Jojo said. The question landed on the table like a knife. Miller's jaw tightened. Lucas looked away. The silence that followed wasn't the productive kind. It was the silence of men confronting something they'd all been thinking, but nobody wanted to be the first to say aloud. Because Gary Silt had gotten into the compound's storage room. Through a door that was locked from the inside, past a security camera that Briggs had installed 18 months ago, a camera that when Coyle checked it 40 minutes earlier showed 6 hours of corrupted footage. Static and dead frames during the exact window when Gary would have entered. Someone inside the Iron Saints had let him in. "Don't," Miller said, reading the direction of Jojo's stare. "Not tonight. We start pointing fingers in this room right now. Denny wins before breakfast." "Then when?" Jojo's voice was flat, controlled. But underneath the control was something that vibrated like a plucked wire, and everyone who'd served with him recognized it as the sound Jojo made when he was deciding whether to trust the people around him or stop trusting them entirely. "When I've got proof," Miller said. "Not suspicion, not gut feeling. Proof." Jojo held Miller's gaze for a long 5 seconds. Then he unfolded his arms, walked to the far side of the garage, and sat down on an overturned engine block with his back to the room. That was the first crack. Lucas felt it open like a fault line under his feet. In 22 years of riding with these men, through arrests and funerals and hospital vigils and the slow, grinding poverty of keeping a brotherhood alive in a town that offered nothing, he had never seen Jojo turn his back on Miller Kane. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation. It was worse. It was a withdrawal of faith, quiet, total, and devastating in its simplicity. Miller saw it too. His hand tightened around the edge of the workbench until his scarred knuckles went white. And for one unguarded moment, Lucas saw something on the old man's face that he'd never seen before. Doubt. Not about the plan. Not about Denny. Doubt about whether the thing he'd built, This fragile architecture of broken men holding each other upright through sheer proximity and shared damage could survive what was coming. Then the moment passed. Miller straightened his spine, pushed his reading glasses up on his forehead, and started talking strategy in the flat, methodical tone of a man who had learned a long time ago that the only alternative to planning was dying. By dawn, the snow had stopped. Gray light leaked through the garage windows like dirty water. Rosevale arrived at 6:15 to pick up Nora, driving the same rusted Civic she'd been nursing through Ohio winters for 9 years. The exhaust pipe held on with a wire hanger, and the heater blowing air that was barely warmer than the cold it was supposed to fight. Lucas met her at the door. He hadn't planned what to say. He'd spent the last 2 hours trying to construct a version of the truth that would inform Rose without terrifying her, and every version collapsed under its own weight because the truth was terrifying and no amount of careful language could file down its edges. Rose looked at his face and stopped walking. She was 33, lean from years of physical work and not enough food, with dark circles under her eyes that never fully went away, and hands that were always slightly raw from industrial dish soap. She wore a diner uniform under a coat that was too thin for February, and she carried herself with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been solving impossible problems alone for so long that she'd stopped expecting solutions and started expecting only the next problem. "What happened?" she said. "Someone was in the building last night. A man. He had surveillance photos on a laptop." Rose's face didn't change. That was the thing about Rosevale that most people missed. She didn't perform her emotions for an audience. Fear didn't make her gasp or tremble or widen her eyes. Fear made her go still. Perfectly, absolutely still, like a woman turning to stone from the inside out. Of what? Families, kids, including Nora. The stillness deepened. Lucas watched her eyes and saw something behind them shift. Not panic, not yet, but the rapid calculation of a single mother mentally cycling through every vulnerability in her life and finding no defenses anywhere. "Who?" she said. "An ex-member named Denny Ross. He's trying to frame the club, make us look dangerous. He photographed Nora at school." Rose's right hand closed slowly into a fist at her side. Her knuckles were red and cracked from dish soap and cold water. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She looked past Lucas into the garage, where Nora was gathering her crayons into a Ziploc bag, with the careful, methodical attention of a child who had learned to take care of her own things because no one else would. "I trusted you," Rose said quietly. "I trusted all of you." The words hit Lucas harder than any fist could. Not because they were angry. They weren't. They were exhausted. They carried the weight of a woman who had placed her child's safety in the hands of men she believed were different from every other system that had failed her, and who was now standing in the cold gray light of a February morning, realizing that this, too, might have been a mistake. "Rose, you told me she'd be safe here. You said this was the one place nobody would bother her. You said that." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the crack was more devastating than screaming because it revealed the scaffolding underneath. The fragile, desperate hope that had allowed Rosevale to leave her daughter in a motorcycle garage 3 nights a week and believe it was the best available option. "She is safe here," Lucas said. "She's the reason we found him. If she hadn't heard, she shouldn't have had to hear anything." Rose's eyes were bright now, not with tears, but with the particular fury of a mother who has been forced to choose between terrible options for so long that the discovery of one more terrible option feels less like a crisis and more like confirmation of everything she already feared. "She's 7. She shouldn't be the one protecting grown men from—" She stopped, swallowed, pressed her fist against her thigh until the knuckles popped. "I'm taking her out of here," she said. "Rose, listen to me. If Denny's people are watching the school, pulling her out of the garage doesn't fix. Don't tell me what fixes things. You don't get to tell me what fixes things." Her voice was low, controlled, but it vibrated with a frequency that Lucas recognized from his years as a combat medic. The frequency of someone holding themselves together through pure will, knowing that if they let go for even a second, they would come apart entirely. She walked past him, took Nora by the hand, and left without looking back. Lucas stood in the doorway and watched the Civic pull away, its taillights blurring red through the falling mist. His cigarette burned down to the filter between his fingers. He didn't feel it. Behind him, Miller's voice came from the shadows. How bad? She's done with us. Can't blame her. Didn't say I blamed her. Lucas flicked the dead cigarette into the slush. Said she's done. Miller was quiet for a moment. Then, if Denny's got spotters on that school, she's not safer out there than she is in here. I know. You gonna tell her that? Lucas turned and looked at Miller with an expression that had no anger in it and no softness either. Just the raw, skinless honesty of a man who had failed to protect one child and was watching the machinery align to fail another. She won't listen to me now, Lucas said, and she shouldn't have to. Miller absorbed that, nodded once, walked back into the garage. The second crack. By mid-morning, the internal fractures had widened. Briggs discovered that the corrupted security camera footage wasn't random. Someone had accessed the system remotely using a login credential that only current members possessed. He presented this information to Miller in front of 4 other members, which was a mistake, because the moment the words "inside access" entered the room, every man in it began looking at every other man differently. Suspicion is a virus. It enters through the ears and spreads to the eyes. Suddenly, every unexplained absence becomes evidence. Every late arrival becomes a meeting with the enemy. Every phone call taken in private becomes a transmission of secrets. The Iron Saints had survived external threats for 23 years because they trusted each other absolutely. Not blindly, not naively, but with the hard-earned trust of men who had bled together and buried together and sat in courtrooms together while the world called them criminals for the crime of existing outside a system that had never offered them a place inside it. Now that trust was cracking and the sound it made was worse than any engine or gunshot or winter wind, it was the sound of silence where conversation used to be. The sound of men choosing their words carefully who had never needed to. The sound of eyes that used to meet now sliding away. Jojo pulled Lucas aside near the parts shelf at 11:30. The big man's face was unreadable, but his hands, those enormous, scarred, tattooed hands that could rebuild a transmission or hold a dying man with equal precision, were restless in a way Lucas had never seen. Coil, Jojo said. One word, no explanation needed. Coil had been the last member to arrive the previous night. He'd come in 40 minutes after everyone else, claiming his truck wouldn't start in the cold. His jacket had been dry. In February. In a sleet storm. Nobody had noticed at the time because nobody was looking for lies inside their own walls. But Jojo noticed everything, and he stored it with the merciless precision of a man who had learned in Helmand Province that the difference between a friend and a threat was sometimes nothing more than a dry jacket in a rainstorm. Don't, Lucas said. Miller said proof. Miller said a lot of things. Jojo's eyes were dark, flat, and absolutely still. Miller also said Denny Ross would never come back. Said we'd handled it. Said the expulsion was enough. That landed hard, because it was true. 4 years ago, when Miller expelled Denny, Lucas and Jojo had both argued for something more permanent. Not violence, but total excommunication, burn his records, warn every club on the eastern seaboard, make sure Denny Ross couldn't find shelter or allies anywhere in the outlaw world. Miller had refused. He'd said Denny was broken, not dangerous. He'd said exile was punishment enough. He'd said the Saints didn't destroy men who were already destroyed. It was the most merciful decision Miller Kane had ever made, and it might have been the worst. You're questioning Miller, Lucas said carefully. I'm questioning the decision, not the man. There's no difference, and you know it. Jojo's jaw muscles worked silently. His eyes moved to the far side of the garage where Miller was on the phone, the club's sole burner pressed to his ear, his free hand rubbing the bridge of his nose in the universal gesture of a man being told things he didn't want to hear. He'd been calling old contacts all morning, retired cops, former members who'd moved away, a private investigator in Columbus who owed the Saints a favor from a decade ago. Searching for current information on Denny Ross, building a map of the enemy's position. Miller made a mistake 4 years ago, Jojo said. Mercy's fine when the other person's finished fighting. Denny wasn't finished. Miller wanted him to be, so he decided he was. That's not mercy. That's wishful thinking. And now a 7-year-old girl's face is on a surveillance photo because a 61-year-old man couldn't accept that some people don't stop. Lucas had no answer for that, Not because Jojo was wrong, but because he was right in a way that couldn't be fixed with words or plans or loyalty. The mistake had already been made. The only question now was what it would cost. Coyle returned from a supply run at noon, carrying bags of coffee and sandwiches from the gas station on Route 9. He walked into a room that had changed temperature since he left, and Lucas watched him register it. The slight hesitation in his step, the quick scan of faces, the almost imperceptible adjustment in his posture from relaxed to guarded. Coyle was good at reading rooms. Afghanistan had taught him that. But it had also taught him that the most dangerous rooms were the ones where nobody was looking at you, because it meant they'd already decided something about you while you were gone. "What I miss?" Coyle said, setting the bags on the workbench. "Nothing," Briggs said too quickly. Coyle's eyes moved to Jojo. Jojo stared back without blinking. The exchange lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it contained an entire conversation: accusation, denial, challenge, warning, compressed into a silence so dense it could have cracked concrete. "All right," Coyle said. He pulled a sandwich from the bag, sat down in the corner booth where Nora usually sat, and ate without speaking. His eyes stayed on his hands. The afternoon dissolved into a series of escalating tensions. Miller's phone calls produced fragments of intelligence. Denny Ross had been living in a rented house outside Steubenville, 60 miles east. He'd been collecting grievances from ex-members of multiple clubs, men who'd been expelled, excommunicated, or disgraced. He was building a coalition of the discarded, but the details were murky, contradicted by different sources, impossible to verify, without getting closer than any of them wanted to get. At 3 p.m., Briggs pulled Miller into the bathroom, the only room without windows, and told him something that made the old man go completely still for 15 seconds. When they emerged, Miller's face was set in the expression Lucas knew as his war face. Not angry, not afraid, but sealed. Every emotion locked behind a door that wouldn't open until the situation was resolved or the man was dead. Miller called a full meeting. 8 men arranged in a rough circle around the workbench, standing because Miller didn't let anyone sit during serious meetings. He believed sitting made men comfortable, and comfortable men made lazy decisions. "Briggs found something on the security system," Miller said. "The remote access that corrupted the footage came through a VPN, but the login credential used was Tomlin's. Ray Tomlin. 46 years old, member for 14 years, a quiet, dependable mechanic who had joined the Saints after his wife left him, and his union job at the steel plant evaporated, and he found himself sleeping in his truck behind a Walmart for 3 months before Lucas found him and brought him in. Tomlin fixed bikes, paid his dues, showed up for every meeting, and never caused trouble. He was the kind of member clubs run on. Not flashy, not ambitious, not a leader, just steady, present, reliable. Tomlin wasn't in the room. He hadn't been at the garage since the previous afternoon. "That doesn't mean it was him," Coyle said immediately, and every head turned because the speed of his defense raised exactly the question he was trying to put down. "I said it was his credential," Miller replied evenly. "I didn't say it was him." "But you're thinking it." "I'm thinking a lot of things, Coyle. Most of them I don't like." The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind where men who have known each other for years suddenly feel like strangers. Where the air between bodies becomes a barrier instead of a bridge. Where every breath sounds too loud and every glance carries too much weight. Jojo broke it. "I'll go to Tomlin's place." "No," Miller said. "Nobody goes anywhere alone. Not until we know who's compromised." "Then send me with someone you trust." The implication was surgical. "Send me with someone you trust," meaning not everyone here qualifies. Meaning the circle of trust had already shrunk, and Jojo was demanding that Miller acknowledge it publicly instead of pretending the brotherhood was still intact. Miller's eyes swept the room. He looked at each man individually, Briggs, Coyle, the others, and in that slow rotation Lucas saw something break inside the old man. Not his resolve, his faith. The belief that he could hold this together through sheer will and decades of earned authority. The understanding that loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that survives pressure and doubt and the poisonous whisper of suspicion, was not a permanent condition but a living thing that required constant nourishment, and that he might have been starving it for years without knowing. "Lucas goes with you," Miller said finally. Everyone else stays. Jojo nodded once and moved toward the door. Lucas grabbed his jacket, cold, stiff, smelling of cigarette smoke and engine oil, and the faint ghost of the aftershave he'd stopped wearing years ago because there was nobody to smell good for. Before he reached the door, Miller's hand landed on his shoulder. The old man's grip was iron despite the arthritic knuckles, and he leaned close enough that Lucas could smell the coffee and exhaustion on his breath. "Bring him back alive," Miller said. "Whatever he is." Lucas looked into Miller's eyes and saw the cost of that sentence written in every line and scar on the old man's face. The cost of being a leader who couldn't afford to hate anyone because hate made you careless, and carelessness in this world killed people. "And if he runs?" Miller's grip tightened. "Then we'll know." Lucas and Jojo rode out into the gray February afternoon on two machines that sounded like controlled thunder against the frozen silence of Harlan Falls. The town slid past in a blur of shuttered businesses and empty lots, and the occasional face in a window that watched them go with the resigned familiarity of people who had lived alongside the Saints long enough to stop being afraid and start being grateful, because at least these men kept the other predators away. Tomlin's trailer sat on a half-acre of mud and dead grass 4 miles east of town, a single wide from the 80s with aluminum siding that had oxidized to the color of old bone. His truck was in the driveway. The lights were off. Smoke came from the chimney, a wood stove, the only heat source, which meant he was home. They parked at the end of the gravel drive. Jojo killed his engine first. The silence that followed was enormous. No traffic, no machinery, no human sound. Just the wind moving through bare trees and the tick of cooling engines. "Let me talk first," Lucas said. "Fine." Jojo's hand rested on his thigh, fingers loose, ready for anything. They walked to the door. Lucas knocked, 3 times, hard, the way you knock when you need someone to know this isn't optional. 30 seconds, a minute. Then the door opened, and Ray Tomlin stood in the gap looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week, which was notable because they'd seen him 48 hours ago, and he'd looked fine. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face unshaven, and he was wearing the same flannel shirt he'd been wearing 2 days earlier, now wrinkled and stained with something dark at the cuff. "Hey," Tomlin said. One word. But it carried the particular weight of a man who already knew why they were standing on his doorstep in the freezing cold, and who had been waiting for this moment with the grim, exhausted resignation of someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion and understanding that he was already inside the vehicle. "We need to talk, Ray," Lucas said. Tomlin's eyes moved from Lucas to Jojo and back. He read the situation the way everyone in this world read situations. Through body language, through what wasn't being said, through the specific quality of silence between 2 men who had ridden 4 miles in February to stand on a doorstep when a phone call would have sufficed. "Yeah," Tomlin said quietly. "I figured." He stepped back and let them in. The inside of the trailer was exactly what Lucas expected. Spare, clean despite the age of everything in it, organized with the particular discipline of a man who had nothing and took care of everything he had because replacement wasn't an option. A single photograph on the wall, Tomlin's daughter, age 12, smiling in a school picture from 6 years ago. She lived with her mother in Pennsylvania now. Tomlin saw her twice a year if the custody schedule held, which it usually didn't. Tomlin sat at his kitchen table. Lucas sat across from him. Jojo stood near the door, arms folded, eyes on the only window. "Your login was used to corrupt the security camera footage," Lucas said. No preamble, no softening. Someone accessed the system remotely with your credential. Tomlin didn't flinch, didn't deny. He stared at his hands, mechanic's hands, permanently stained at the knuckles, calloused and cracked, and breathed in slowly through his nose. "I know," he said. Lucas felt his pulse accelerate. Behind him, he heard Jojo shift his weight, a tiny movement that in the vocabulary of the man's body language was equivalent to a shout. "You know," Lucas repeated, "because I gave it to him." The trailer went absolutely silent. The wood stove popped. A gust of wind pressed against the aluminum walls and moved on. Outside, the sky was the color of lead, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and stopped. Tomlin raised his eyes. They were wet, Not crying, not yet, but filled with the terrible brightness of a man about to say something that would end a part of his life permanently, and who understood the weight of that ending with total, devastating clarity. "He has my daughter," Tomlin whispered. Lucas felt the floor tilt. The room contracted. Every assumption he'd built over the last 12 hours rearranged itself around this single statement, and the picture that formed was so much worse than betrayal that it made betrayal look like a mercy. Jojo's arms dropped to his sides. His face, which had been stone for 24 hours, cracked for the first time. A micro-expression of horror so brief and so genuine that it vanished almost before it appeared. But Lucas caught it, and it was the most frightening thing he'd seen since the photograph of Nora near the monkey bars. "He has Lily," Tomlin said again, his voice breaking now, the scaffolding collapsing. "Denny Ross has my daughter. He took her from her school in Scranton 4 days ago, and he told me if I said one word to anyone, one word, he couldn't finish." His hand came up and covered his mouth, and the sound he made behind it was not sobbing. It was something rawer and more broken than that. The sound of a man being crushed by the precise machine of his own impossible choices. And in that tiny freezing trailer, with the wind howling outside and the wood stove dying and the gray light fading toward another brutal Ohio evening, Lucas Creed understood with absolute, horrifying certainty that this was no longer about surveillance photos or framed evidence or club politics. A child was missing. Again. And the last time he'd stood in a room where those words were spoken, he'd trusted the system and done nothing, and a girl named Emma had vanished into a darkness from which she never returned. Lucas looked at Jojo. Jojo looked back, and in the silence between them, two damaged men in a dead man's trailer at the edge of a forgotten town. A decision formed that neither of them spoke aloud because speaking it would have made it real. And real meant there was no going back. There was no going back. Lucas didn't call Miller. Not yet. He sat across from Ray Tomlin in that freezing trailer while the wood stove ticked toward cold and the gray afternoon light died against the aluminum walls, and he listened to a man dismantle himself one sentence at a time. Tomlin talked the way wounded men talk when the wound finally opens, in fragments, in circles, doubling back to correct details that didn't matter, and skipping over details that mattered enormously, his voice cracking and rebuilding and cracking again like ice on a river that couldn't decide whether to hold or break. Jojo stood by the door and didn't move, didn't interrupt. His face had returned to stone, but his eyes, those dark, unblinking eyes that had watched men die in Helmand Province and registered each death as a permanent entry in a ledger he would carry until his own, were locked on Tomlin with an intensity that made the air in the trailer feel thin. 4 days ago. That was when it started. Tomlin's ex-wife, Karen, had called him in hysterics at 6 in the morning. Lily hadn't come home from school. She'd been picked up by a man in a black SUV who told the school office he was Lily's uncle, showed a fake ID, signed her out during last period. The school hadn't called Karen, hadn't verified, hadn't done anything except hand a 12-year-old girl to a stranger and mark her absent for the next day's attendance. "They just gave her away," Tomlin said, and his voice on those words was something Lucas would hear in his sleep for months. The specific frequency of a father confronting the mathematical precision with which institutions designed to protect children had instead delivered his daughter into the hands of a man who wanted to use her as leverage against a motorcycle club 200 miles away. 3 hours after Lily disappeared, Tomlin's phone rang. Unknown number. A voice he recognized immediately. Denny Ross, calm, almost friendly, speaking in the measured tones of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times. The instructions were simple. Give Denny remote access to the Iron Saints security system. Disable the camera on the storage room entrance. Leave the back door unlocked on the night of February 14th. Say nothing to anyone. Do exactly as told, and Lily would be returned unharmed within 72 hours of the operation's completion. He said 72 hours, Tomlin repeated, as if the specificity of the number was itself a cruelty, a countdown imposed on a father's sanity, a clock that ticked inside his skull every second of every day, measuring the distance between obedience and his daughter's life. "Did he prove it?" Lucas asked. His voice was steady, clinical. He was in medic mode now. The psychological space where emotions were quarantined and only information mattered, because information saved lives and emotions got people killed. He'd learned that in Fallujah, unlearned it when Emma disappeared, and was learning it again now with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that this was his second chance, and that second chances did not come with third ones attached. Tomlin reached into his back pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to unlock it. He opened the messages and turned the screen toward Lucas. A photograph. Lily Tomlin, sitting on a bare mattress in a room with gray walls and no windows. She was wearing the same school uniform she'd been wearing when she was taken. Blue polo, khaki skirt, white sneakers. Her face was pale but composed. She was holding a piece of paper on which someone had written yesterday's date in block letters. Proof of life. Standard protocol for someone who had studied how kidnappings work. Below the photo, a text message. She's comfortable. Keep it that way. Lucas stared at the image for a long time. The room, the bare mattress, the deliberate absence of identifying details. No window, no furniture, no visible landmark. Professional. Which meant Denny had help. Not Gary Silt-level help, not fumbling operatives hiding under shelves with crowbars, but organized, experienced help from someone who knew how to hold a hostage without leaving evidence. "Did you call the police?" Lucas asked, knowing the answer before Tomlin shook his head. He said if I called anyone to... He'd know within the hour. He said he had someone inside Scranton PD. Tomlin's eyes were red, raw, stripped of everything except the specific terror of a man who believes he is being watched at all times, and has no way to verify whether that belief is paranoia or precision. Maybe he's lying. Maybe he doesn't have anyone. But I can't... His voice broke again. I can't test that. Not with Lily. Lucas looked at Jojo. The big man's jaw was set so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. His arms were folded again, and his right hand gripped his left bicep with a force that would leave bruises. He was holding himself together the way a man holds a cracked dam, through pressure, through will, through the understanding that if he let go, the flood would destroy everything downstream. "We need to tell Miller," Jojo said. Not gently. Not with compassion. With the flat surgical directness of a man who understood that compassion in this situation was a luxury that would cost time, and time was measured in the heartbeats of a 12-year-old girl in a room with no windows. Tomlin's head snapped up. "No, you can't. If Denny finds out I told anyone, Denny already knows, Ray." Jojo's voice cut through the trailer like a blade through wet canvas. "We found his man. We found the earpiece. The operation's burned. The only question now is what Denny does next, and if he's smart, and he is, the first thing he does is move the girl somewhere we'll never find her." The blood drained from Tomlin's face. Lucas watched it happen in real time, the color retreating from his cheeks and lips and forehead like a tide going out, leaving behind a gray, hollow landscape that looked decades older than the man who had been sitting there 30 seconds ago. "Oh no," Tomlin whispered. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." "Ray." Lucas reached across the table and gripped Tomlin's wrist. Hard. Not comfort. Anchor. "Look at me. We're going to find her, but you need to tell us everything, every detail, every conversation, every instruction Denny gave you, everything." Tomlin looked at Lucas with the drowning eyes of a man who had been treading water alone for 4 days and had just felt the current change beneath him, not toward safety, but toward a deeper, faster, colder channel that he couldn't navigate alone. He talked for 45 minutes. Lucas and Jojo rode back to the compound in silence. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The roads were black ice under a thin scrim of snow, and the bikes moved with the cautious precision of animals crossing frozen water. Lucas's mind was a map pinned with fragmentary data. Scranton, a black SUV, a room with gray walls, a 12-year-old girl holding yesterday's date. Somewhere in those fragments was a location, a thread to pull, but every thread was tangled with another thread, and every knot was tightened by the same question. How much time did they have before Denny realized his ground operation was compromised and decided Lily Tomlin was a liability instead of leverage? They pulled into the compound at dusk. The floodlight over the garage entrance cast a harsh white cone through the falling snow. Inside, the lights were back on. Miller had apparently decided that sitting in darkness was no longer tactically useful, or perhaps he'd simply gotten tired of not being able to read the faces of the men he wasn't sure he could trust. Lucas found Miller in the bathroom, standing at the sink with water dripping from his face. The old man had removed his reading glasses and his cut, and without them he looked diminished, not smaller but less armored, more human, more breakable. His silver beard was damp. The bags under his eyes had deepened overnight into bruise-colored hollows that made his face look like a landscape after heavy weather. "Tell me," Miller said, reaching for the towel. Lucas told him everything. He spoke in the compressed, fact-first cadence he'd used for after-action reports in the Army. Location, situation, assets, threats, timeline. No adjectives, no emotion, just the architecture of the crisis laid out in its component parts. Miller listened with his hands braced on either side of the sink, head down, water still dripping from his jaw. He didn't interrupt. He didn't curse. He didn't move. When Lucas finished, the silence in the bathroom lasted 12 full seconds. Lucas counted, before Miller raised his head and looked at his own reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. What Lucas saw in the old man's eyes was not surprise. It was recognition. The look of a man meeting a consequence he'd spent 4 years pretending wouldn't arrive. "I let him walk," Miller said quietly. His reflection stared back at him with the pitiless clarity of a mirror that doesn't forgive. 4 years ago, I broke his patch, I took his cut, and I let him walk. You and Jojo wanted more. I said no. I said he was done." He paused. The faucet dripped. The sound was metronomic, relentless. Each drop a tiny percussion marking the distance between the decision he'd made then and the reality he was living now. "I was wrong." Lucas said nothing. There was nothing to say. Miller wasn't looking for absolution or argument. He was performing the brutal internal accounting that leaders perform when their mercy comes back wearing a different face. The honest, unflinching tally of cost versus intention that reveals mercy's price only after the invoice arrives. "How long does Tomlin think we have?" Miller asked. "He doesn't know. Denny's timeline had Phase 3 9 days out, but that was before we found Gary. Now everything accelerates. The girl, 12 years old, name's Lily. She's being held somewhere near or in Scranton. Tomlin has no address. Denny uses encrypted messaging, single-use numbers, no patterns." Miller turned off the faucet. He stood upright, and Lucas watched the transformation. The man reassembling himself, pulling the armor back on piece by piece. The cut, the glasses, the posture, the voice. By the time Miller opened the bathroom door and walked back into the garage, he was the president again, and the doubt that had lived in his eyes for 30 seconds was locked behind a door that only he had the key to. But Lucas had seen it, and he would remember. Miller called the room together. Everyone, even Coyle, who stood at the edge of the circle with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the floor, radiating the particular stillness of a man who knows he's being watched and has decided not to fight it. Even Briggs, who kept glancing at Coyle with the nervous energy of someone who has lit a fuse and isn't sure how long it is. "Tomlin's daughter has been kidnapped," Miller said. No preamble, no softening. The words entered the room like a cold wind and touched every man in it. "Denny Ross took her from her school in Scranton 4 days ago. He's using her as leverage. That's why the security footage was corrupted. That's why the back door was unlocked. Tomlin wasn't a traitor. He was a father with a gun to his kid's head." The silence that followed was a different species entirely from the suspicion-laden silences of the previous 24 hours. This was the silence of men recalibrating. Men who had spent the day doubting each other now processing the information that the enemy's strategy was more sophisticated, more cruel, and more personal than any of them had imagined. The doubt didn't disappear, but it couldn't, not entirely, not after suspicion had already planted its roots, but it shifted, redirected, focused outward instead of inward, toward the man who had weaponized a father's love for his child and turned it into an instrument of destruction. Jojo spoke first. "So we're not dealing with a grudge, we're dealing with a hostage situation." "We're dealing with Denny Ross," Miller said, "which means we're dealing with everything at once. The frame job is still live, the media package is still out there, the fake evidence still exists, and now there's a child in a room somewhere that we can't find, being held by people we can't identify, on a clock we can't see. Cops, Briggs said. FBI, Amber Alert, whatever it takes. Tomlin says Denny claims he's got someone inside Scranton PD. Miller's voice was flat. Could be a bluff. Could be real. But the moment we go to law enforcement, two things happen. One, Denny's frame job activates automatically. He's probably got a dead man switch on the media package, set to distribute if he doesn't check in. Two, the first thing any cop is going to ask is why a motorcycle club is involved in a child kidnapping. And by the time we explain the answer, Lily Tomlin might be... He stopped. Didn't finish. Didn't need to. The room absorbed the incompleteness of that sentence the way it absorbed everything. In silence, in stillness, in the private internal reckonings of men who understood that some sentences don't have endings, because the endings are too terrible to speak aloud. So what do we do? Coyle asked. His voice was steady, and for the first time since the crisis began, it carried no defensiveness, no guardedness, just the honest question of a man who had been suspected of betrayal and was now standing in a room where a child's life depended on what happened next, and who had decided that being useful was more important than being vindicated. Miller looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not trust restored, but an acknowledgement that the mathematics of the situation had changed, and that whatever Coyle was or wasn't, his hands and his brain and his combat experience were needed. "We find her ourselves," Miller said. The plan came together in pieces over the next 3 hours, assembled on the workbench under fluorescent lights that hummed with the particular frequency of electrical systems running on borrowed time. Miller worked the burner phone, calling contacts in Pennsylvania, cross-referencing what little information Tomlin had provided, trying to build a geographic profile of where Denny might hold someone within reasonable distance of Scranton. Lucas commandeered the laptop they'd taken from Gary Silt and started pulling data. Email fragments, browser history, cached GPS coordinates that Gary had been too sloppy or too rushed to delete. What he found made his hands go still on the keyboard. Gary Silt's browser history contained directions to 3 locations, all within a 40-mile radius of Scranton. The first was a commercial storage facility off Interstate 81. The second was a foreclosed house in a town called Dunmore. The third was a shuttered machine shop on the outskirts of Old Forge, a building that, according to the property records Lucas pulled from a public database, had been purchased 8 months ago by a shell company called Ridgeline Properties, LLC. 8 months. The same length of time Gary Silt had been working for Denny. Lucas cross-referenced the address with satellite imagery cached on the laptop. The machine shop sat at the end of a dead-end road backing up to a rail yard. No residential neighbors. No foot traffic. One access road in, one out. The kind of location you choose when you need privacy and don't care about comfort. He showed Miller. The old man studied the screen, his reading glasses low on his nose, his lips moving slightly as he processed the geography. Then he looked up at Lucas, and in that look was a question that neither of them wanted to ask, because asking it meant acknowledging a threshold they were about to cross. "If we're wrong," Miller said, "we just broke into a building that doesn't belong to us and committed a felony that Denny can use to bury us. If we're right, there's a 12-year-old girl in there." Miller nodded slowly. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, no rallying cry, no cinematic moment where the music swells and the heroes ride into the sunset. There was just a tired old man standing under bad lighting in a freezing garage in Ohio, making a calculation about risk and consequence and the weight of a child's life against the survival of everything he'd built, and arriving at the only answer that his broken, scarred, stubbornly decent soul would permit. 3 riders, Miller said. You, me, Jojo. Nobody else. If this goes wrong, it goes wrong on us, not the club. Miller, not negotiable, Lucas. If Denny's got this place wired, if it's a trap, if we're walking into a setup designed to put Iron Saints members at a crime scene that Denny controls, I need the rest of the club clean. I need witnesses who can say they were here, in this garage, with alibi and distance. If the 3 of us go down, the club survives. If the club goes down, nobody survives. The logic was impeccable and terrible, The logic of a man who had spent 23 years making decisions that traded pieces of himself for the survival of something larger, and who was now preparing to trade the largest piece yet. Jojo was already pulling on his gloves. They left at 9 p.m. 3 motorcycles rolling out of the compound in formation. Miller in front, Lucas in the middle, Jojo bringing up the rear. The snow had stopped, but the cold was merciless. The kind of February cold that doesn't just chill you, but reaches inside and wraps around your bones like a hand. The roads were empty. The sky was starless, cloud-covered, black as engine oil. Their headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, and the sound of 3 straight-pipe Harleys echoing off the frozen hills of eastern Ohio was the loneliest sound Lucas had ever heard. They rode east, past the shuttered steel mills and the empty lots, past the diner where Rose Vale was probably pouring coffee right now, unaware that the men she'd trusted with her daughter were riding toward something that might end them. Past the county line where Ohio becomes Pennsylvania, and the landscape shifts from flat farmland to rolling hills choked with bare trees and abandoned coal towns. Lucas rode with Emma's face in his mind. Not the school photo, the real face, the last time he'd seen her, 3 months before she disappeared. She'd been sitting on his sister's kitchen counter, eating an apple, telling him about a book she was reading about wolves. She loved wolves, just like Nora. The symmetry was so precise it felt less like coincidence and more like the universe offering him a second chance, wrapped in the same packaging as his worst failure. He couldn't fail again. Not this time. Not with Lily. Not with Nora. Not with any of them. They stopped for gas at a station outside of Newcastle at 11 p.m. The attendant, a kid barely out of high school, working the overnight shift with earbuds in and textbook open behind the register, didn't look up twice at 3 bikers in cuts and road grime filling their tanks in the middle of a freezing night. In towns like these, bikers were part of the landscape. Furniture, background noise. Miller bought 3 black coffees from the machine. They stood outside under the buzzing fluorescent canopy, exhaust curling from their mouths, engines ticking beside them. "When we get there," Miller said, wrapping both hands around the paper cup for warmth, "Jojo takes the perimeter. Lucas and I go in. If it's empty, we leave clean. If she's there—" He paused, sipped. The coffee was terrible, and he drank it like it was medicine. "If she's there, we get her out, and we call the cops from the road. Anonymous tip. The building, the girl, everything. Let the system pick up the pieces." "And Denny?" Jojo asked. "Denny comes after. Once Lily's safe, we take everything we have. The laptop, the fake evidence, the timeline, Tomlin's testimony, Gary Silt. And we hand it to every law enforcement agency and every news outlet that will listen. We don't fight him. We expose him. And if he's there?" Jojo's voice was quiet, careful, asking the question that hovered beneath every plan and every calculation like a shadow beneath ice. "If Denny Ross is in that building when we walk in?" Miller stared into his coffee. The steam rose and dissolved into the freezing air, and his face behind it looked ancient. Not just old, but ancient in the way that certain landscapes look ancient, shaped by forces too large and too relentless to resist, carrying the marks of every storm that had ever passed over them. "Then we handle it," Miller said. "The way we handle everything. Ugly, slow, with whatever we've got." He threw the rest of the coffee into the snow, mounted his bike, and rode east without looking back. They reached Old Forge at 1:30 in the morning. The town was dead. Not sleeping. Dead. Row houses with windows dark as eye sockets. Streets empty except for the occasional cat moving through the shadows like a thought. The rail yard on the south edge threw up a low industrial hum that vibrated through the frozen ground and into the frames of their motorcycles. The machine shop sat exactly where the satellite imagery said it would. End of Elm Street, behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that had been cut in 3 places and bent back. The building was cinder block and corrugated metal, 2 stories, with a loading dock on the north side and a single pedestrian door on the east. No vehicles visible. No lights. But the razor wire had been cut recently. The edges were bright, unrusted. Someone was using this place. They killed the engines 2 blocks out and pushed the bikes behind an abandoned coal truck parked in a vacant lot. The silence was absolute. No wind, no traffic, no dogs, Just the distant hum of the rail yard and the sound of three men breathing cold air through clenched jaws. Jojo moved first. He circled the building in a crouch, staying tight to the fence line, checking sight lines and exits with the practiced economy of a man who had cleared buildings in Kandahar and Marja and half a dozen places the news never mentioned. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he returned, his face told Lucas everything. Back door's been reinforced from inside. New padlock on the loading dock. Fresh tire tracks in the lot. SUV tread. Recent, maybe 12 hours. He paused. And there's light. Second floor, northeast corner. Faint. Like a lamp behind a curtain. Lucas's chest tightened. A lamp. In a shuttered machine shop at 1:30 in the morning. In a building purchased 8 months ago by a shell company connected to a man who had kidnapped a 12-year-old girl. Miller checked his phone. No signal. 3 bars had dropped to 0 somewhere between the highway and this dead-end street, which might have been the terrain or might have been something else entirely. He pocketed the phone without comment. East door, Miller said. Lucas and I go in. Jojo, you hold the perimeter. Anyone comes or goes who isn't us, you... I know. They moved. The padlock on the east door was a heavy-duty master, but the hasp it was attached to was screwed into wood that had been rotting for decades. Lucas pulled a pry bar from inside his cut, a 12-inch steel rod he'd been carrying since Fallujah, not as a weapon, but as a tool, though the distinction had blurred over the years, and worked the hasp free in 30 seconds. The screws came out of the frame like teeth from soft gums. The door opened into a ground floor that smelled like machine oil, damp concrete, and something else, something human. Sweat, food, the lingering metabolic scent of a body in a confined space. Lucas's pulse spiked. He forced it down, controlled his breathing the way the army had taught him. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. His flashlight beam swept the floor. Machinery covered in tarps. A workbench with takeout containers on it. Chinese food, recent, the rice still soft when he pressed a chopstick into it. Stairs in the northwest corner, metal, the kind that ring when you step on them unless you place your feet at the very edge, near the wall, where the bolts anchor the tread and absorb the vibration. Lucas knew this because he'd climbed stairs like these in buildings like these in cities that looked nothing like this one but felt exactly the same. The same dread, the same precision, the same unbearable awareness that what you found at the top would change everything. They climbed in silence, Miller behind Lucas. The old man's knees were audible, a faint grinding that he couldn't suppress. But his footwork was precise, every step placed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that noise was the difference between rescue and catastrophe. The second floor was a single open space bisected by a drywall partition that hadn't been there when the building was a functioning machine shop. Someone had built it recently. The tape on the seams was still white, the paint still faintly chemical. And behind that partition, visible through a gap where the drywall didn't quite meet the ceiling, was light, yellow-orange, warm, the kind of light that came from a small lamp, the kind you'd put in a room where someone was sleeping or where someone was being kept. Lucas pressed his eye to the gap. A mattress on the floor, a plastic bucket in the corner, a case of bottled water, half empty, a wool blanket, and curled beneath the blanket, facing the wall, so still she might have been dead except for the slow rise and fall of the fabric over her ribs, Lily Tomlin. Lucas's vision blurred. For one terrible second, the room split in two. The room he was seeing now, and the room he'd imagined for 6 years. The room where Emma might have been held. The room that existed only in his nightmares, furnished with the same mattress, the same bucket, the same desperate, minimal provisions that said, "We're keeping you alive, but we want you to know how easy it would be to stop." The 2 rooms overlapped, merged, separated, and then Lucas blinked and he was back, and there was only this room and only this girl and only this moment. He turned to Miller. The old man's face was wet, not from exertion. His eyes were streaming silently, the tears cutting tracks through the grime and exhaustion on his cheeks. And he made no move to wipe them, because wiping them would require acknowledging them, and acknowledging them would require feeling them, and feeling them right now would be a luxury that a 12-year-old girl locked in a room at the top of a dead building in a dead town could not afford. Lucas tried the partition door. Locked. A deadbolt, keyed from the outside. He looked at the hinges, standard residential, 3 screws each, top and bottom. The pry bar would work, but it would be loud. He leaned close to the gap and spoke in a voice barely above breath. "Lily, my name is Lucas. I know your father. We're here to take you home." Silence. Then the blanket moved. A face emerged, pale, drawn, eyes enormous in the lamplight, staring at the gap near the ceiling where a stranger's voice had just entered the only space she'd known for 4 days. "Are you with them?" she whispered. "No, I'm with your dad." "My dad rides motorcycles." "Yes, he does." A pause. A calculation happening behind those 12-year-old eyes that should never have needed to learn this kind of arithmetic. The calculation of trust versus survival, of whether the voice in the dark was rescue or a new variation of the same threat. "Prove it," she said. Lucas closed his eyes. What did he know about Tomlin? What detail could he offer that only a member of the Iron Saints would possess? His mind raced through years of quiet proximity, rebuilding engines side by side, sharing silent cigarettes outside the garage, the small accumulations of knowledge that men who don't talk much gather about each other through observation alone. "Your dad has a photograph of you on his wall," Lucas said. "School picture. You're wearing a blue sweater. You're 12 in the picture, but he says you look like your mom in it, and he means it as the best thing he's ever said about anyone." Silence. Then the blanket fell away entirely, and Lily Tomlin stood up on shaking legs and walked to the door. "Get me out," she said, and her voice on those 3 words was the bravest sound Lucas Creed had ever heard. He worked the hinges. The pry bar slid behind the first hinge pin, and he levered it upward with controlled force, catching the pin in his palm before it could clatter to the floor. 1 down. Miller positioned himself at the gap in the drywall, watching the staircase, his body blocking the only approach with the same instinct that had put him between danger and his brothers for 23 years. Second hinge. The pin resisted. Lucas adjusted his grip, applied more pressure. The metal groaned. Lily flinched on the other side of the door but didn't step back. The pin popped free. Lucas pulled the door sideways off its frame, deadbolt still engaged but irrelevant now, and Lily Tomlin stepped through the gap into the open space of the second floor. Small, shivering, wearing a school uniform that was wrinkled and stained and still somehow intact, her eyes blinking in the darkness beyond her lamplit cell. Miller shrugged off his leather cut. The weight of it, the patches, the 23 years of identity it represented, and wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. The cut hung past her knees. She pulled it tight. "Can you walk?" Lucas asked. "I can run," she said. They moved toward the stairs. Miller first, then Lily, then Lucas covering the rear. They descended in the same precise footwork they'd used going up. Edges of the treads, near the bolts. Minimal sound. The ground floor was as they'd left it. The east door stood open, the broken hasp dangling. They were 15 feet from the exit when Lucas heard it. An engine. Not a Harley. Something heavier. A diesel. Coming fast down Elm Street, its headlights sweeping through the gaps in the loading dock doors and painting the walls of the machine shop in moving stripes of white. Then a second engine. And a third. Lucas grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her behind a tarp-covered lathe. Miller dropped low behind the workbench. Outside, through the thin walls, they heard doors slamming. Voices. Male. Multiple. Sharp with authority. And then a sound that stopped Lucas's heart. The metallic rack of a shotgun being chambered. Not cops. Cops announce. Cops have radios and sirens and protocol. This was something else. Through the gap in the loading dock, Lucas saw them. 4 men in dark jackets, 2 carrying weapons, moving toward the east door with the coordinated purpose of people who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find. And leading them, stepping out of the first vehicle with his hands in his pockets, and a smile on his face that Lucas could see even in the darkness, because it was the kind of smile that generates its own cold light. Denny Ross. Miller saw him too. The old man's entire body went rigid. His hands, those scarred, arthritic hands that had built the Iron Saints from nothing and held them together through everything, curled into fists at his sides. Denny stopped at the east door. He examined the broken hasp, The smile didn't change. If anything, it widened. The expression of a man who has just received confirmation that his prey is exactly where he wanted it. He leaned into the doorway and spoke into the darkness, his voice carrying with the easy confidence of someone who believes he controls every variable in the equation. Miller, I know you're in there. I know you brought the medic and the Marine, and I know you found the girl. A pause. The diesel engines idled behind him like mechanical breathing, which means I know exactly where all three of you are. And I know you can't call anyone. And I know that right now you're doing the math in your head, and the math is telling you that you're outnumbered, outgunned, 200 miles from home, with a 12-year-old child standing next to you in the dark. The silence that followed was total. Lily Tomlin pressed against Lucas's side. He could feel her heartbeat through Miller's leather cut, fast, terrified, the heartbeat of a child who had survived 4 days alone in a locked room and was now learning that rescue was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different, possibly worse chapter. Denny's voice came again, softer now, almost gentle, and the gentleness was the most dangerous thing about it. Come out, old man. Let's talk about what happens next. Because the way I see it, you've got about 90 seconds before my friends stop being patient. And patience. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that ricocheted off the concrete walls and died in the dark. Patience was never really their thing. Lucas looked at Miller. Miller looked at Lily. Lily looked at both of them with eyes that held no illusion, no false hope, and no surrender. The eyes of a child who had already learned the worst lesson the world teaches, which is that safety is not a place but a decision made by the people standing closest to you. And in that frozen moment, crouched in darkness in a dead building at the edge of a dead town, with 4 armed men at the door and a smiling predator framing himself against the headlights, Lucas Creed understood with perfect, annihilating clarity that every skill he'd ever learned, every wound he'd ever survived, every failure he'd ever carried, all of it had been preparing him for exactly this. The question was whether preparation was enough. 90 seconds. Lucas counted them in heartbeats because his watch was buried under his sleeve, and moving his arm would make noise, and noise would make Denny's men come through that door faster than 90 seconds. Lily Tomlin pressed against his ribs, her breathing shallow and rapid, her fingers gripping the edge of Miller's leather cut so tightly that the old patches crackled under the pressure. Miller crouched 3 feet to his left behind the workbench, his face invisible in the dark. His presence felt only as a density in the air, a gravitational mass of exhaustion and fury and calculation working at a speed that belied his 61 years. 78 seconds. Lucas scanned the ground floor with peripheral vision trained by a decade of operating in darkness. East door. Compromised. Denny standing in it. Loading dock. Chained from outside. No exit. Northwest corner. The stairs they'd just descended. And to the south, partially hidden behind a row of dead machinery, a fire door marked by the faint phosphorescent glow of a deteriorating exit sign. He hadn't noticed it coming in. The sign was half dead, one letter flickering, the rest dark. But the door was there. Steel, industrial, hinged to open outward. If it wasn't bolted, if it wasn't welded shut, if it led anywhere other than a wall. 60 seconds. Lucas touched Miller's shoulder. 2 taps. Then he pointed south. He couldn't see Miller's face, but he felt the old man's head turn, felt the pause as Miller's eyes adjusted and found the exit sign, felt the micronod that traveled through the shoulder under his fingertips. Miller leaned close. His breath was hot and stale against Lucas's ear. Take the girl. I'll buy time. No. Wasn't asking. Miller, take the girl. The words were barely sound. They were pressure, the compression of 23 years of authority into 4 syllables that left no room for negotiation, no crack for argument, no space for anything except obedience or defiance. And Lucas had never defied Miller Kane in his life, and the old man knew it. 45 seconds. Outside, boots crunched on frozen gravel. Denny's men were repositioning, 2 moving toward the loading dock, 1 staying at the east door. Denny himself hadn't moved. His silhouette filled the doorframe, backlit by diesel headlights, his posture relaxed with the specific ease of a man who believes he has already won and is simply waiting for the formalities of victory to complete themselves. Lucas made a decision that would live inside him forever. He wrapped his arm around Lily's shoulders, pulled her tight against his body, and began moving south through the darkness toward the fire door. Every step was placed with the agonizing precision of a man walking through a minefield. Heel first, testing the floor for debris, then rolling forward to the ball of the foot, absorbing his own weight so completely that even his breathing seemed to leave no mark on the silence. Lily matched him. Step for step, breath for breath. This 12-year-old girl, who had spent 4 days locked in a room with a bucket and a mattress, moved through pitch darkness with a discipline that broke Lucas's heart because it meant she had learned, somewhere in those 4 days, in that gray room with no windows, how to make herself invisible, how to compress her existence into the smallest possible space, how to survive by disappearing. 20 seconds. They reached the fire door. Lucas pressed his palm flat against the steel. Cold. He felt for a deadbolt, a chain, a padlock. Nothing. Just a push bar, standard commercial hardware, probably original to the building. He wrapped his fingers around it and pressed down. The mechanism resisted, seized by years of rust and disuse. He pressed harder. Metal ground against metal with a sound that, in the absolute silence of the ground floor, might as well have been a gunshot. Denny's voice came instantly. "Time's up, Miller." 2 things happened in the same heartbeat. Miller Kane stood up from behind the workbench. He rose to his full height, 6 feet, which had been 6'1" before the years compressed his spine, but which in that moment looked taller than any man had a right to be. And he walked toward the east door, not fast, not slow, with the measured, unhurried stride of a man who had spent his entire adult life walking toward things that frightened lesser men, and who understood that the final gift he could give the people behind him was time, and that time was purchased with the only currency he had left, which was himself. And Lucas threw his entire weight against the fire door. It burst open. Cold air flooded in. Not fresh, not clean, but frozen and metallic, carrying the taste of rail yard diesel and old snow. Beyond the door was a narrow alley running between the machine shop and a concrete retaining wall. 20 feet wide, choked with frozen weeds and discarded pallets, lit by nothing except the ambient glow of industrial lights from the rail yard 200 yards south. Lucas pushed Lily through the door. "Run," he said. "Straight ahead, don't stop." "What about—" "Run." She ran. Her sneakers slapped the frozen concrete, and the sound of it, the rapid, desperate percussion of a child fleeing, was the most urgent sound Lucas had ever heard, more urgent than gunfire, more urgent than the IED detonations that had scored the first 28 years of his life with shrapnel and nightmares. He turned back toward the door, toward the interior of the building, toward Miller. He could hear voices inside. Denny's, sharp with surprise. Other voices, deeper, commanding. The heavy footfall of men moving fast through an unfamiliar space. And underneath all of it, Miller Kane's voice, low, steady, utterly calm, saying words that Lucas couldn't make out, but whose tone he recognized instantly as the tone Miller used when he was negotiating, stalling, buying seconds with sentences the way a magician buys misdirection with his left hand while his right hand does the real work. Then Jojo appeared. He materialized out of the darkness of the alley like something that had always been there and had simply decided to become visible. He was breathing hard. His jacket was torn at the left shoulder, and there was blood on his right knuckles. Not his, Lucas decided instantly, because Jojo's injuries never showed on his hands, and his eyes were wide in a way that Lucas had seen exactly once before, in Helmand, the night their convoy hid an ambush, and Jojo had pulled 3 Marines out of a burning MRAP with his bare hands. "There were 2 more, Jojo said, parked on the next street, watching the back. I handled it." Lucas didn't ask what "handled it" meant. He didn't need to. Jojo's definition of handled was precise and non-negotiable, and left very little room for follow-up questions. "Miller's inside," Lucas said. Jojo's face changed. The wide-eyed combat alertness shifted into something darker, colder, more focused. The expression of a man whose operational priorities have just been rearranged by a single piece of information, and whose body is already moving before his mind finishes processing. Where's the girl? Running south, alley, toward the rail yard. Go, get her. I'll get Miller. Jojo, go get the girl, Lucas. The words hit with the same unmovable force that Miller's had. Different register, not authority, not command, but something closer to an oath, a promise made in a voice that would not accept refusal, because refusal would mean breaking the only contract Jojo Baines had ever honored without reservation. The contract that said you don't leave your people behind. Not in Helmand, not in Harlan Falls, not in a dead machine shop in Pennsylvania where an old man was standing between a predator and the door. Lucas ran. He ran south down the alley with his boots hammering frozen concrete and his breath tearing ragged holes in the cold air and his body operating on the specific cocktail of adrenaline and terror and desperate purpose that he'd last felt running through the streets of Fallujah toward the sound of an explosion, knowing that what he'd find would be terrible and going anyway because the alternative, the stopping, the hesitating, the calculating of odds, was a luxury that belonged to people who hadn't sworn to protect the ones who couldn't protect themselves. He found Lily at the end of the alley, pressed against the retaining wall, shaking so hard the leather cut on her shoulders vibrated like a struck bell. Her eyes found him in the dark, and the relief in them was so enormous and so fragile that Lucas felt it physically. A pain in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the weight of being the person a child trusts in the moment when trust is the only thing standing between them and annihilation. You're okay, he said. He said it like a fact, not a comfort, because facts were the only currency worth anything right now, and comfort was a luxury they'd buy later, after, if there was an after. The old man, Lily said. Is he? Someone's getting him. We need to move. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Same dead zone as before. He needed elevation, or distance, or both. The rail yard sprawled to the south, a labyrinth of tracks and idle freight cars and service buildings. Beyond it, according to the map Lucas had memorized from the satellite imagery, was Route 11, a state highway that would have cell coverage and traffic and the minimum infrastructure of civilization that meant a phone call to 911 would actually reach someone. They moved. Lucas kept Lily on his left side, between himself and the retaining wall, his right hand free. They skirted the rail yard fence line, moving east, using the hulking shadows of parked freight cars as cover. The industrial hum was louder here, transformers, signal equipment, the low-frequency throb of infrastructure that never sleeps. It masked their footsteps, but it also masked everything else, which meant Lucas had to compensate with his eyes, scanning constantly, processing every shadow as either threat or geometry. 3 minutes into their movement, Lily stumbled. Her sneakers, school shoes, thin-soled, designed for linoleum hallways and not frozen industrial terrain, slipped on a patch of black ice, and she went down hard on one knee. She didn't cry out, didn't make a sound, just caught herself on her hands, pushed back up, and kept moving. Lucas looked at her face and saw something that transcended age, a determination so fierce and so absolute that it burned through the exhaustion and the fear like a welding arc through sheet metal. Almost there, he said. She nodded once, the same small, serious nod that Nora Vale used, the same economy of gesture, the same ancient, unflinching refusal to waste energy on performance when survival demanded everything. Behind them, from the direction of the machine shop, came a sound that stopped them both. A crash. Metal on concrete. Followed by a shout, deep, enormous, reverberating off the buildings like an avalanche inside a canyon. Jojo's voice. Not a word. A sound. The sound of a man exerting force beyond normal human limits. The kind of sound that emerges from the place where training and fury and love converge into a single, devastating action. Then silence. Then, impossibly, improbably, beautifully, the thunderous ignition of a Harley-Davidson engine. Not one, two. The sound rolled through the frozen night like a declaration of war and survival and defiance and everything the Iron Saints had ever been. Not a gang, not a crew, not a criminal enterprise, but a collection of broken men who had looked at each other across the wreckage of their lives and decided, without sentimentality or illusion, that the people standing next to them were worth whatever it cost to keep standing. Lucas's knees nearly buckled. He grabbed the fence for support. The engines were moving, north to south, fast. The distinctive potato-potato exhaust note of straight pipe Harleys cutting through the industrial hum like a blade through fog. They were riding south, toward the alley, toward the rail yard, toward him. Two headlights appeared at the south end of the machine shop's alley, swinging wide around the retaining wall, bouncing over frozen ruts and debris. Lucas stepped into the light and raised both arms. The lead bike braked hard, the rear tires sliding on ice, the rider controlling the skid with the reflexive precision of 30,000 miles of bad road experience. Miller Kane pulled off his helmet. His face was a landscape of damage, a cut above his left eye streaming blood into his beard, his lower lip split, his right hand cradling his left wrist in a way that suggested something was broken or badly sprained. He was breathing in the short, shallow gulps of a man who had recently been hit very hard in the ribs, and his eyes, those gray, exhausted, ancient eyes, were blazing with a light that Lucas had never seen in them before. Not rage, not triumph. Something closer to clarity. The terrible, purifying clarity of a man who has just traded the last illusions he had about the world for the concrete, irrefutable knowledge that he is capable of exactly what the moment demands. Behind him, on the second bike, Jojo sat with his engine idling and blood on his knuckles and his torn jacket flapping in the wind, and an expression on his face that was the closest thing to peace Lucas had ever seen there. The specific peace of a man who has just done the thing he was built to do and done it well. "Denny?" Lucas asked. "Running," Miller said. He wiped blood from his eye with the back of his wrist. His boys scattered when Jojo came through the loading dock like a freight train. One of them might have a broken jaw. Hard to tell in the dark. "And Denny?" "Drove east. Fast. Alone." Miller looked past Lucas to Lily, who was standing against the fence with his cut still wrapped around her, staring at the motorcycles with an expression that wavered between awe and disbelief. "She okay?" "She's walking. She's tough." "Yeah, she'd have to be." Miller winced as he adjusted his grip on the handlebars. The wrist was definitely bad. His fingers on the left hand weren't closing properly. "We need a phone. We need to call this in." They rode south. Lily sat behind Lucas on his bike, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back. She was shaking, not from cold, though the cold was savage, but from the full-body tremor of accumulated adrenaline releasing its hold on a nervous system that had been running at maximum capacity for 4 days. Lucas felt every tremor through his jacket, through his shirt, through the layer of scar tissue on his back where the Fallujah shrapnel had exited, and each one registered as a separate, specific reminder of why he was here and what it meant and what it would cost him if he failed. They reached Route 11 in 7 minutes. Lucas's phone found 1 bar of signal, then 2. He pulled off the road into the empty parking lot of a closed farm supply store, killed the engine, and dialed 911 with hands that were steady only because he commanded them to be, overriding every nerve and every memory and every instinct that was screaming at him to keep moving, keep riding, put as much distance as possible between Lily Tomlin and the building where she'd been kept. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Lucas spoke in the flat, precise voice he'd used for casualty reports. Location, situation. A 12-year-old girl recovered from a kidnapping. An abandoned machine shop at the end of Elm Street in Old Forge. Multiple suspects, armed, fled the scene. At least one identified as Dennis Ross, last seen driving east. "Send police. Send everyone." He hung up before the dispatcher could ask follow-up questions. There would be time for questions later. There would be an infinity of questions later. From police, from FBI, from prosecutors, from reporters, from the systems that had failed Lily Tomlin at every step, and would now demand, with the particular audacity of institutions that never accept blame, to know exactly how a group of motorcycle club members had succeeded where every official mechanism had not. But that was later. Right now, in this frozen parking lot, under a sky that had finally cleared enough to show a handful of stars burning cold and distant above the Pennsylvania hills, there was only this. 3 men and a girl, breathing, alive, together. Miller dismounted his bike with the careful movements of a man cataloging his injuries. Ribs, wrist, the cut above his eye still seeping. He walked to Lucas's bike and crouched down until he was eye level with Lily. She looked at him from behind Lucas's shoulder, her face pale and drawn, and immeasurably older than 12. "Your dad's waiting for you," Miller said. His voice was gentler than Lucas had ever heard it, not soft, because Miller Kane didn't do soft, but stripped of every pretense and defense, until what remained was the raw, exposed nerve of a man who understood exactly what this child had survived, and who would spend the rest of his life carrying the knowledge that his own failure of judgment 4 years ago had made it possible. "Is he okay?" Lily asked. "He's scared. He's been scared since you were taken, but he's okay." "He didn't do anything wrong," Lily said, and the urgency in her voice, the desperate need to protect her father from blame, even while she herself was still shaking from 4 days of captivity, cracked something open in Miller's chest that would never fully close again. "He was trying to help me. He was doing what the man told him. He was—" "I know," Miller said. "I know exactly what he was doing, and when you see him, you tell him Miller Kane said he did the right thing. You tell him that." Lily's lower lip trembled for the first time. Not during the rescue, not during the run through the alley, not when she heard Jojo's roar echo off the machine shop walls. Now, in this moment of safety, this parking lot, this pause, the trembling came because the body only releases what it's holding when it finally believes the danger is past. And Lily Tomlin's body had been holding 4 days of terror, and she was 12 years old, and the dam was breaking. She didn't cry. Not yet. But she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Miller's shoulder, and the old man wrapped his good arm around her and held her there, and the only sound was the tick of cooling engines and the distant hum of trucks on Route 11 and the impossibly quiet breathing of a child who had just learned that the scarred, bloody, broken man holding her was safer than every institution the world had ever built. Jojo stood apart. He leaned against his bike with his arms folded, watching the road, watching the sky, watching everything and nothing with the hypervigilant scan of a man who wouldn't fully stand down until they were home and the doors were locked and every person under his protection was accounted for. The blood on his knuckles had dried black in the cold. He didn't wash it off. He wouldn't, Lucas knew, until the job was finished. A superstition or a ritual, or just the stubborn refusal of a man who believed that evidence of action should be visible until the action was complete. 20 minutes later, the first siren. Blue and red lights flickering through the bare trees on Route 11, moving fast, multiplying. 2 Pennsylvania State Police cruisers, then a third, then an unmarked sedan. They converged on the parking lot with the organized urgency of a system that had finally been activated and was now operating at full capacity, too late to prevent and just in time to document. The next 3 hours were a blur of statements, examinations, and the particular bureaucratic machinery of law enforcement processing an event that didn't fit its standard categories. Lily was taken to an ambulance, checked, wrapped in thermal blankets, given water and a protein bar that she ate in 4 bites with the efficient hunger of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. A female state trooper sat with her, speaking in low, careful tones that Lucas monitored from 20 feet away with the specific attention of a man who had learned that the systems meant to help could also, through carelessness or incompetence or simple human failure, cause additional harm. Miller gave his statement 3 times. To a patrol officer. To a detective. To a plainclothes agent who arrived an hour into the process and identified himself as FBI out of the Scranton field office. Each time, Miller told the same story in the same flat, exhausted voice. The surveillance, the frame job, the kidnapping, the rescue. He left nothing out. He embellished nothing. He stood under the portable floodlights that the police had erected in the parking lot, his face a mask of blood and bruises and complete unflinching honesty, and he answered every question with the patience of a man who understood that cooperation was not weakness but strategy, and that the truth, the full, ugly, unvarnished truth, was the most powerful weapon he had left. The FBI agent's name was Weiss. Mid-40s, dark coat, expression carefully neutral in the way of federal officers who are trained to process information without displaying reaction. He listened to Miller's account, took notes on a tablet, and asked one question that cut through 3 hours of procedure like a scalpel through gauze. "You rode 200 miles into another state. broke into a building, and extracted a kidnapping victim without contacting law enforcement at any point. Why? Miller looked at Weiss with eyes that had seen the inside of a prison cell and the inside of a hospital room and the inside of every dark corner that America offers to men who exist outside its official boundaries. His answer was 4 words long. Nobody else was coming. Weiss held the look for a 5 count. Then he closed his tablet, put it in his coat pocket, and said, "The machine shop is being processed now. We've issued a BOLO for Dennis Ross. We'll need all of you in Scranton tomorrow for formal statements." "We'll be there," Miller said. "The evidence you mentioned, the laptop, the fabricated documents, the surveillance materials, all at our garage in Harlan Falls, secured, untouched, waiting for you." Weiss nodded. Something passed across his face. Not approval, not sympathy, but the brief, involuntary acknowledgement of a federal officer, recognizing that the men standing in front of him had done something that his own agency had failed to do, and that the bureaucratic calculus of that failure would be someone's problem, but not tonight's. He left. The patrol officers left. The ambulance left, carrying Lily to a hospital in Scranton, where Tomlin was already waiting, having been driven east by Coyle and Briggs the moment Miller called the garage from the gas station phone to relay the news. And then it was 3 again. Miller, Lucas, JoJo. Standing in an empty parking lot in Pennsylvania at 4:30 in the morning, surrounded by the debris of institutional attention. Tire tracks, floodlight imprints in the mud. A single latex glove dropped by a paramedic and already freezing to the asphalt. Miller sat down on the curb. Just sat down. His legs gave out with the sudden total collapse of a body that had been running on adrenaline and willpower for 36 hours and had finally exhausted both. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his head hanging and his bloody, broken hand cradled in his lap. And for the first time since Lucas had known him, Miller Kane looked like exactly what he was. A 61-year-old man with bad knees and worse decisions, and a body held together by scar tissue and stubbornness, who had just ridden 200 miles through a frozen night to pull a child out of a room where his own mistake had put her. "We need to go home," Lucas said quietly. "In a minute." "Miller?" "I said in a minute." The old man's voice cracked. Not the gravel crack, the other kind. The kind that comes from underneath. From the place where the foundations live, where the weight of everything a man has built and rebuilt and broken again finally exceeds the structural capacity of the human being carrying it. Lucas sat down next to him. Not touching. Just present. The way the Iron Saints did things. Not with words or comfort or the performance of emotion, but with proximity. With the simple, stubborn act of being there. JoJo stayed standing. He watched the road. He would watch the road until they left, and he would watch the mirrors all the way home, and he would watch the garage door close behind them when they arrived, and he would not stop watching until the thing he was watching for, the threat, the consequence, the shape of whatever Denny Ross did next, either materialized or dissolved, because Denny Ross was still out there. The frame job was still loaded. The media package still existed somewhere on a server or a hard drive, or a dead man's switch that would activate on a timer or a trigger that none of them understood. The fake evidence, the doctored photos, the fabricated police reports, all of it was still live, still lethal, still capable of destroying the Iron Saints if Denny chose to deploy it from wherever he'd fled. And Denny Ross, Lucas knew with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had studied predators in combat and in peacetime and understood that the most dangerous ones were never the loudest, was not finished. He was recalculating, rerouting, adapting. The machine shop was burned, the kidnapping was exposed, but Denny's real weapon, the narrative, the frame, the ability to make the Iron Saints look like the villains in a story where they were the only ones who had acted, was still intact. Miller knew it too. Lucas could see it in the set of the old man's shoulders, in the way his good hand kept closing and opening in a slow, rhythmic fist, in the way his eyes tracked across the empty parking lot as if reading a map that only he could see. "He's going to release it," Miller said. Not a question, a certainty. The media package, the fake tips, all of it. He's going to release it because it's the only move he has left. He can't hurt us physically now. The FBI knows his name, his face, his operation, but he can destroy our reputation. He can make every news outlet in Ohio run the story of a motorcycle gang connected to a child kidnapping. He can make the narrative look like we were the threat, not the solution, and by the time the truth catches up, the damage is done. Lucas stared at the frozen ground between his boots. The mathematics of reputation destruction were simple and merciless. A lie moves at the speed of outrage, and the truth moves at the speed of bureaucracy, and the gap between those two speeds is where innocent people get crushed. "How long?" Lucas asked. Miller was quiet for a moment, calculating. Running the same calculus he'd been running for 23 years, the calculus of threat and response, of timing and leverage, of how much damage you can absorb and still remain standing. "Hours," Miller said. "Maybe less. He knows we talked to the FBI. He knows the clock is running. If he's going to use the frame, he uses it now, before the official narrative catches up." "Then we beat him to it." Miller raised his head, looked at Lucas. The question was in his eyes, but he didn't ask it, because asking would have meant admitting that he didn't have an answer, and Miller Kane had spent 23 years being the man with the answer. "We have everything," Lucas said. His voice was steady now. Not medic steady, something deeper, something that came from the place where 6 years of guilt over Emma and 4 days of terror over Lily and 1 night of revelation about what he was capable of had fused into a single, unshakable certainty. Gary Silt, the laptop, the timeline, Tomlin's testimony, the FBI agent's card. We have the real story. Every piece of it, documented, witnessed, and sitting in our garage waiting to be told. And we tell it first, before Denny can spin it, before the fake version hits. We give everything to the FBI. Everything. And we call every journalist, every news desk, every local outlet that will listen, and we give them the truth. Not our version of the truth. The actual truth, the evidence, the timeline, the kidnapping, the rescue, all of it. We don't hide behind the club. We don't play the outlaw card. We stand in front of cameras, and we say exactly what happened, and we let the world decide who the real threat is. Miller stared at him. The seconds stretched. The cold pressed in from every direction, and the stars above were hard and indifferent and utterly silent. "That means exposing the club," Miller said slowly. "Every member, every face, every name on a patch. We go public, we don't get to go back to being invisible. The garage, the compound, Harlan Falls, it all becomes a story. And stories don't belong to the people who live them. They belong to whoever tells them loudest." "Then we tell it loudest." Miller looked at Jojo. Jojo looked back. The big man's face was stone, but his eyes, for one flickering instant, held something that might have been admiration or agreement, or the simple recognition that the man proposing this plan was not the same man who had walked into Tomlin's trailer 12 hours ago. Miller exhaled. The breath came out white and ragged and hung in the air like a flag of surrender, not to Denny, not to the world, but to the reality that the Iron Saints could no longer survive by staying invisible, and that the price of protecting the people they loved was the armor they'd spent 23 years building. "All right," Miller said. He braced his good hand on his knee and pushed himself to his feet. His body protested at every joint. He ignored it the way he'd ignored pain for 61 years, not by pretending it didn't exist, but by deciding it didn't matter. "We ride home. We get cleaned up, and then we burn it all down before Denny does." He walked to his bike, mounted it with a wince that he didn't try to hide, kicked the engine to life. The Harley roared in the frozen silence, and the sound of it, that deep, chest-rattling, unmistakable thunder, rolled across the empty parking lot and the dead fields and the sleeping Pennsylvania hills like a promise. Not a promise of violence, not a promise of victory. A promise that 3 broken men on 200 miles of frozen highway were coming home, and that when they got there, the truth was coming with them. And the truth, unlike mercy, unlike patience, unlike every other weapon Miller Kane had ever chosen, was the one thing Denny Ross could not outrun. They rode west, into the dark, into the cold, into whatever was waiting on the other side of dawn. And behind them, somewhere in the electronic dark of a server that none of them had ever seen, Denny Ross's finger hovered over a button that would send fabricated evidence to 14 media outlets, 3 law enforcement agencies, and every rival motorcycle club on the eastern seaboard. A button that, once pressed, would turn the Iron Saints from rescuers into monsters in the time it takes a headline to load. The race was no longer about distance. It was about who spoke first. They beat him by 47 minutes. Miller made the call from a gas station payphone outside of Youngstown at 5:20 in the morning, his broken wrist braced against his hip, his good hand gripping the receiver so tightly the plastic creaked. He called Agent Weiss first. The FBI man answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't slept either, which meant the machinery of federal investigation was already turning, and Miller's call was accelerant on a fire that had already been lit. He gave Weiss the location of every piece of evidence in the Iron Saints garage. The laptop, the printed timeline, Gary Silt, who was still zip-tied to a folding chair under Briggs's watch, and who had been talking steadily for 6 hours with the exhausted relief of a man who had chosen the wrong side and knew it, and wanted nothing more than to stop carrying the weight of what he'd been asked to do. Then Miller called the Columbus Dispatch. Then Channel 4 in Cleveland. Then the Harlan Falls Courier, a weekly paper run by a 68-year-old woman named Dorothy Polk, who had been covering the town since before the steel mills closed, and who picked up the phone at 5:30 in the morning without complaint, because Dorothy Polk had been waiting her entire career for a story that mattered, and she knew the sound of one when it called. To each of them, Miller said the same thing. Not a speech, not a performance, just facts delivered in the gravel and glass voice of a man who had driven 200 miles through a frozen night with a broken wrist and blood drying in his beard and nothing left to protect except the truth. A child was kidnapped. A motorcycle club found her. The same man who took her had been building a campaign to destroy the club using fabricated evidence. The evidence, real and fake, was available for inspection at the Iron Saints compound in Harlan Falls, Ohio, and the FBI was already en route. He hung up each time before they could ask questions. Questions would come later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was velocity. Getting the true story into the air before Denny's poisoned version could land. At 6:07 in the morning, as the first gray light of February crept across the Ohio border, Denny Ross pressed his button. The fabricated media package went out to 14 outlets simultaneously. Doctored photographs, fake police reports, manufactured text messages designed to make the Iron Saints look like a predatory organization using its garage as a front for activities too terrible to name. The package was slick, professional, engineered to trigger exactly the kind of reflexive outrage that destroys reputations before evidence can be examined. The digital equivalent of a firebomb thrown through a window at 3 in the morning. It landed on desks that were already occupied. The Columbus Dispatch had Miller's statement and Agent Weiss's confirmation before Denny's package arrived. Channel 4 had already dispatched a crew to Harlan Falls. Dorothy Polk had been on the phone with the Pennsylvania State Police for 20 minutes and had more verified facts in her notebook than Denny's entire fabrication contained. The fake evidence didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in a space already filled with truth, and the collision between the two was immediate, visible, and devastating to the liar. By noon, the story had inverted. What Denny had designed as an attack became its own exposure. Media outlets that received his package compared it against the verified evidence from the FBI and the Iron Saints, and found the seams, timestamps that didn't match, metadata from images that proved they'd been doctored, text messages that digital forensics revealed had been composed on a single device and distributed to fake accounts. The fabrication, examined in the light of competing truth, fell apart like wet paper. By evening, Dennis Ross was the story, not the Iron Saints, not the motorcycle club that society had trained itself to distrust on sight. The story was a man so consumed by resentment that he'd kidnapped a child to destroy the people who had expelled him. The story was a 12-year-old girl recovered from a windowless room by 3 men who rode 200 miles through freezing darkness because, as their club president had told a federal agent in a parking lot at 4 in the morning, nobody else was coming. Denny Ross was arrested at a motel outside of Erie, Pennsylvania at 9:14 p.m. on February 16th. He was alone. He had a laptop, 2 burner phones, and a duffel bag containing enough clothing for a week and $9,000 in cash. He did not resist. The arresting officers reported that he said nothing during the arrest except one sentence, directed at no one in particular, spoken with the flat effect of a man watching the architecture of his own destruction complete itself. Miller should have finished it when he had the chance. Maybe so. But Miller Kane had never been the kind of man who finished things the way Denny Ross understood finishing. Miller's version of finishing was slower, harder, less dramatic, and infinitely more durable. It was the version where you stood in the light and told the truth and let the systems that had failed you for decades do, for once, what they were supposed to do. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't cinematic. It was just right. The weeks that followed were measured not in events but in textures. The texture of institutional attention, federal agents in the garage, evidence bags and chain of custody forms, and the particular bureaucratic reverence with which law enforcement handles a case that makes them look bad and they know it. The texture of media scrutiny, cameras in the parking lot, reporters knocking on the compound door, requests for interviews that Miller declined with a single word and a closed door. The texture of legal process, depositions, grand jury proceedings, the slow grinding machinery of justice applying itself to a case that didn't fit its usual categories and required new language to describe. Gary Silt cooperated fully and received a reduced charge. His testimony, combined with the laptop evidence in Tomlin's account and the physical evidence recovered from the machine shop in Old Forge, built a federal case against Denny Ross that the U.S. Attorney's Office described in a press conference as one of the most meticulously documented harassment and kidnapping conspiracies we've prosecuted in this district. Denny was charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, evidence fabrication, and 7 counts of stalking. The trial wouldn't happen for months, but the indictment was sealed, the bail was denied, and Dennis Ross sat in a federal holding facility in Pittsburgh while the world he'd tried to destroy went on without him. Tomlin's daughter came home. That happened quietly, the way the most important things in Harlan Falls always happened, without cameras, without ceremony, without any of the performative machinery that the outside world attaches to moments of reunion. Karen drove Lily from the hospital in Scranton to Tomlin's trailer on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucas and Jojo were there, not inside, not involved, just present, sitting on their bikes at the end of the gravel drive, engines off, watching the road in both directions the way they'd been watching it since Old Forge, because the habit of vigilance, once activated by real threat, doesn't switch off on command. It stays. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are. Tomlin came out of the trailer when the car pulled in. He'd shaved. He'd cleaned the place. He'd bought flowers. Grocery store roses in a plastic sleeve, the kind that cost $4 and die in 2 days, placed in a mason jar on the kitchen table because he didn't own a vase. These details mattered because they were the language of a man who had nothing to give except effort, and who had poured every ounce of it into making a single-wide trailer in rural Ohio feel like a place worth coming home to. Lily got out of the car. She stood in the mud and looked at her father, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for a long time. The distance between them, 12 feet of frozen ground, contained 4 days of terror and 6 years of custody schedules and a lifetime of missed dinners and truncated phone calls, and the particular anguish of a parent who loves completely and is permitted to express that love only in increments determined by a court. Then Lily ran. She covered the 12 feet in 3 steps and hit Tomlin's chest with enough force to stagger him backward, and he caught her and held her, and his legs gave out and they sank to the ground together, kneeling in the mud of his front yard, and the sound he made was not crying. It was something beyond crying. The total catastrophic release of a man whose body had been clenched around a single terror for days, and who was finally allowed to let go. Lucas watched from the end of the drive. His cigarette burned untouched between his fingers. Beside him, Jojo sat motionless on his bike, and Lucas saw something on the big man's face that he'd never seen there before. Not tears, not softness, but a stillness so complete and so deep that it looked like the surface of water after a storm, when the chaos has passed, and what remains is the vast, quiet, irreducible fact of survival. They left without speaking. Some moments don't need witnesses, they need space. The compound changed after that, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the specific, accumulative way that a building changes when the people inside it begin to see themselves differently, not as outcasts maintaining a perimeter, but as something more deliberate and more vulnerable than that. Miller started it. 3 weeks after Old Forge, he called a meeting and proposed something that would have been unthinkable a month earlier: opening the garage to the community, not as a clubhouse, not as a territory, as a resource. Safety workshops for parents and kids, how to recognize surveillance, how to document threats, how to navigate the gaps in a system that was built to protect people in theory and abandon them in practice. Self-defense basics. Emergency contact networks for families in the dead zones of rural Ohio, where police response times were measured in fractions of hours, and help, when it came at all, came too late. The vote was unanimous, which surprised no one because the men in that room had all, in the last 2 weeks, looked at the photograph of Nora Vale standing alone near the monkey bars and understood in their bones that the thing they'd been doing quietly and instinctively for years, watching, guarding, standing between vulnerability and threat, was not a sideline of who they were. It was the center. Jojo taught the self-defense classes. This was, by any measure, the most unexpected development in the history of the Iron Saints, because Jojo Baines had built his entire adult life around the principle that communication was unnecessary and silence was sufficient, and the only language worth speaking was the language of action. But he stood in front of groups of mothers and teenagers and elementary school kids, and he demonstrated how to break a wrist grip, how to create distance, how to scream in a way that carried. He spoke in short, precise sentences that wasted nothing. He never smiled during the classes. He didn't need to. The kids trusted him instantly, the way kids trust large, quiet animals. Not because they're safe in the conventional sense, but because their danger is legible, visible, pointed outward, and therefore paradoxically the safest thing in the room. Briggs and Coyle repaired the security camera system and extended it to cover a 3-block radius around the elementary school. They did this on their own time, with their own money, using skills acquired through careers that polite society would have preferred they didn't have. Nobody at the school board asked how 2 men with felony records knew how to install commercial-grade surveillance equipment. Nobody asked because the cameras worked and the coverage was complete, and the alternative, trusting the township to fund a security upgrade that had been on the deferred maintenance list for 7 years, was not an alternative at all. Miller's wrist healed badly. The doctor at the county clinic told him he needed surgery, pins, plates, the kind of reconstruction that required insurance he didn't have and recovery time he couldn't afford. Miller wrapped it in an AC bandage, took ibuprofen that Briggs bought in bulk from a discount pharmacy, and adapted. His left hand never fully closed again. He learned to grip wrenches with 3 fingers and a thumb. He learned to ride with modified controls that Tomlin fabricated in the garage from scrap aluminum and welded with the focused precision of a man repaying a debt he would never consider settled. Tomlin came back to the club. This was not a given. After the kidnapping, after the exposure of his forced betrayal, there had been a period, 2 weeks, maybe 3, when nobody knew whether Ray Tomlin would walk through the garage door again. The shame was its own kind of prison. He had given an enemy access to his brothers' lives. He had compromised the safety of the compound. He had done it for reasons that every man in the club understood, and none of them blamed him for, but understanding and blame are different currencies, and they don't always spend the same way. It was Jojo who fixed it. Not with words, Jojo didn't fix things with words. He rode out to Tomlin's trailer on a Saturday morning and parked in the driveway and sat on his bike for 45 minutes without moving, without knocking, without making any attempt to enter. Just sitting. Present. Visible. When Tomlin finally opened the door and stood on his steps with a coffee mug in his hand and confusion on his face, Jojo said 5 words. "Bike needs a valve adjustment." Tomlin stared at him. Jojo stared back. The silence lasted 10 seconds. Then Tomlin set down his coffee, pulled on his jacket, and followed Jojo to the garage. And by that evening he was elbow-deep in a shovelhead engine, and Briggs was handing him wrenches, and Coyle was arguing about jet sizes and the rhythm of the garage, that specific, unreplicable rhythm of men working together in functional silence, had restored itself as naturally and as inevitably as a river returning to its bed after a flood. Spring came late to Harlan Falls that year. The snow held into March, and the cold didn't break until the first week of April, when a warm front moved in from the southwest and melted everything in 48 hours, turning the compound yard into a lake of mud and snowmelt that reflected the sky in murky, imperfect mirrors. The The first warm Saturday brought sunlight so bright it felt foreign, an intrusion from a kinder climate, a reminder that Ohio was capable of gentleness even after months of proving otherwise. Rosevale brought Nora to the garage that afternoon. Lucas saw the Civic pull in from the doorway where he was leaning against the frame, smoking, watching the mud dry. He hadn't spoken to Rose since the morning she'd taken Nora and left, since she'd said, "I trusted you," in a voice that carried the weight of every broken promise every institution had ever made her. He'd thought about calling. He'd picked up his phone a dozen times and put it back down each time because he didn't have words that were adequate to the situation, and inadequate words would make it worse. Rose parked. She sat in the car for a full minute before opening the door. Lucas could see her through the windshield, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes on the garage, her face working through something that he recognized because he'd seen the same expression in his own bathroom mirror every morning for 6 years. The expression of a person deciding whether to trust again after trust has cost them. She got out. Nora got out. The girl was wearing a new jacket, not new from a store, new to her, probably from a church donation bin or a friend's outgrown pile, but clean and warm and the right size. She carried her sketchbook under one arm. Her eyes found Lucas immediately and stayed on him with that same watchful, ancient intensity that had saved the Iron Saints on a freezing February night when nobody else was listening. Rose walked toward the garage. Her steps were deliberate, each one a choice. She stopped 3 feet from Lucas and looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was not forgiveness. Forgiveness implies a transaction, a debt paid, and what had happened between them was not a debt but a wound, and wounds don't get paid. They heal or they don't, and the healing is its own process, ungoverned by the wishes of the people carrying them. "I read the news," Rose said. "Yeah." "The girl in Pennsylvania, Lily." "Yeah." Rose's jaw tightened. She looked past Lucas into the garage, where Miller was sitting at the workbench with his bandaged wrist and his reading glasses and a mug of coffee, and Jojo was sweeping the floor with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and Tomlin was adjusting a carburetor with 3 other men watching and occasionally offering wrong advice. "Nora asks about this place," Rose said. "Every day. She asks if the men with the motorcycles are okay." Lucas felt something shift in his chest. Not break. Rearrange. The shrapnel of 6 years of guilt, and the shrapnel of this winter's crisis, and the shrapnel of standing in this doorway watching the only people who had ever needed his protection cycling through danger and survival and tentative, imperfect recovery. All of it rearranged itself around the image of a 7-year-old girl asking every day whether the damaged men who had made space for her in their broken world were okay. "She can come back," Lucas said. "If you want. When you want. On your terms." Rose looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were dry. Her face was still. The calculation happening behind that stillness was enormous. A mother weighing every variable, every risk, every failure of every system that had brought her to this moment, against the single, stubborn, irreducible fact that her daughter had been safer in a room full of scarred bikers than she had been anywhere else in Harlan Falls. "My terms," Rose said. "Your terms." Rose nodded once. Then she walked past him into the garage, and Nora followed, and the girl climbed into her booth and opened her sketchbook and started coloring without a word, and the men around her, those damaged, exhausted, stubbornly decent men who had ridden through the worst winter of their lives and come out the other side with less armor and more purpose, absorbed her presence the way the garage had always absorbed her presence, quietly, completely, as if she had never left. Miller looked up from his coffee and saw Nora in the booth. His face did something complicated, a series of micro-expressions that traveled from surprise to relief to something deeper and harder to name, something that looked like the face of a man watching a wound close in real time. He didn't say anything. He raised his mug an inch in her direction, the smallest possible acknowledgement, the most restrained possible welcome, and went back to his coffee. Nora colored for 20 minutes before she got up, walked across the garage, and stood in front of Miller's workbench. She held up her sketchbook. The page showed a wolf, the same subject she always drew, dark fur, pale eyes. But this one was different. This wolf was surrounded by other wolves, a pack. 7 of them, arranged in a loose circle, facing outward, each one watching a different direction. And in the center of the circle, protected by the pack's collective vigilance, was a small wolf pup sitting in the grass. Miller looked at the drawing for a long time, his reading glasses fogged. He took them off, wiped them on his shirt, and put them back on. And when he looked at the drawing again, his eyes were bright, in a way that had nothing to do with the glasses, and everything to do with the particular cruelty and beauty of being understood by a 7-year-old child who drew wolves because wolves didn't live inside lines. "That's us, huh?" he said. Nora nodded. "You drew us pretty good." "The big one is Jojo." She pointed to the largest wolf, positioned at the front of the pack, facing the viewer with an expression that was somehow both threatening and calm. "He doesn't smile, but he watches everything." From across the garage, Jojo's sweeping paused. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders shifted. A tiny adjustment, a nearly invisible softening, and then he resumed sweeping with the same focused intensity as before. And if his strokes were slightly slower, slightly less mechanical, slightly more like the movements of a man who had just been seen clearly by someone too young to know how rare that was, nobody mentioned it. Miller reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, because the jacket was hanging on the back of his chair, and reaching for it pulled at his ribs, which were still bruised from old forge, and would be bruised for another month. He pulled out something small, metallic, dull with age. A military dog tag on a beaded chain. He'd carried it for 30 years. Not his own, but his younger brother's, who had died at 22 in a training accident at Fort Bragg, years before the Iron Saints existed, years before Miller had understood that the only way to survive his brother's death was to build a family from the wreckage of other people's losses. He turned the tag over. On the back, scratched into the metal with a nail or a knife point, was a single word that his brother had etched there the week before he died. A word that had meant something private between them, something about being the youngest in a loud family, about being the one nobody listened to until it was too late. "Noticed." Miller unclasped the chain and held it out to Nora. "You earned this, kid." Nora took the dog tag. She held it in both hands and studied it the way she studied everything, carefully, completely, with the gravity of a child who understood that some objects carry more weight than their material suggests. She turned it over, read the word, and looked up at Miller with an expression that was not a smile, but was something adjacent to a smile, something warmer and more permanent. The expression of a person who has been seen by the world for the first time and has decided quietly to accept being seen. She put the chain around her neck. The tag hung to the center of her chest. She tucked it under her jacket and went back to her booth and continued coloring wolves. That evening, after the sun dropped behind the hills and the garage lights came on and the temperature fell back toward the familiar punishing cold that Harlan Falls wore like a uniform, Lucas stood in the doorway and smoked his last cigarette of the day. The compound yard had dried enough to show patches of gravel and the first barely visible suggestions of green pushing up through the mud. Not grass yet, not anything with a name, just the stubborn, molecular evidence of a world deciding to continue. Rose's Civic was still in the lot. She was inside drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup that Briggs had poured for her, sitting on an overturned milk crate with her coat still on and her posture still guarded, but her face, for the first time Lucas had ever seen, undefended. Not open, not vulnerable, just present. A woman allowing herself to exist in a space without calculating exit routes. Behind the garage, above the back door. The same door that had rattled on a February night while a man crouched in the storage room with a laptop full of surveillance photos. Someone had bolted a metal plaque to the wall. Lucas didn't know who. Might have been Tomlin. Might have been Jojo, though the idea of Jojo operating a drill and masonry bits to mount a decorative plaque was so incongruous that Lucas preferred not to think about it too carefully. The plaque was plain steel, the letters cut with a plasma torch, the edges rough and unfinished in the way that everything the Iron Saints made was rough and unfinished because perfection was a luxury and function was a principle. It read, "Listen when the quiet ones speak." Lucas looked at it. He thought about Emma. He thought about Lily. He thought about Nora. 3 girls, 3 different stories, 3 different outcomes. One lost, one recovered, one still here, still coloring, still watching rooms with those ancient, unsettling eyes. The symmetry was imperfect. It didn't resolve cleanly. Emma was still gone. The guilt was still there, living in the same place it had always lived, behind his ribs, beneath the scar tissue. It would always be there. He understood that now with a clarity that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply true. The way the cold in Ohio was true. The way the rust on the garage walls was true. The way the sound of Harley engines on a winter evening was true. Some things you don't get over. You get through. And getting through means carrying the weight forward, not setting it down, because setting it down would mean forgetting, and forgetting would be the final betrayal of a girl who deserved to be remembered. But the weight was different now. Lighter wasn't the right word. It wasn't lighter. It was distributed, shared, held not by one man standing alone in a doorway, but by a garage full of damaged people who had looked at each other through the worst season of their lives, and decided, without speeches or vows or any of the ceremonial architecture that the world attaches to moments of commitment, that they would keep standing. Together. For the ones who couldn't stand alone. Inside, Jojo finished sweeping. He leaned the broom against the wall, walked to the coffee machine, poured himself a cup, and stood beside the jukebox drinking it in silence. Nora looked up from her sketchbook, studied him for a moment, and then returned to her wolves. Across the room, Miller adjusted his reading glasses and started going over invoices with his 3 functional fingers and his unfailing stubbornness. Tomlin and Coyle argued about jet sizes. Briggs checked the security cameras, all 12 of them, all functioning, all covering every angle of the compound and the 3 surrounding blocks with the comprehensive vigilance of a man who had learned the hard way what happens when you leave blind spots. Rose finished her coffee. She set the cup down, stood up, and walked to Nora's booth. She leaned down and said something in her daughter's ear. Too quiet for anyone else to hear, a private communication between a mother and a child in the particular dialect of intimacy that belongs only to the 2 of them. Nora nodded. Rose straightened up, glanced around the garage one more time with an expression that was not trust, not yet, but was the precondition for trust, the willingness to remain in a space long enough to find out whether trust was warranted. She walked to the door, past Lucas, stopped. "Same time Thursday?" she asked. "Same time Thursday." She walked to her car. Nora stayed in the booth. The arrangement had reformed, imperfect and provisional, and infinitely more honest than it had been before, because now it was built not on assumption or desperation, but on the shared understanding that safety was not a guarantee but a practice, a thing you built every day with attention and presence and the stubborn, unglamorous commitment to watching the doors. Lucas flicked his cigarette into the mud. He turned back to the garage. The neon beer sign in the window buzzed and flickered, casting its familiar red and blue glow across the concrete floor. The space heater hummed. The coffee machine gurgled through its ancient cycle. And underneath all of it, steady and quiet, and easy to miss if you weren't listening, the sound of a 7-year-old girl turning pages in a sketchbook, drawing wolves that lived outside the lines, surrounded by a pack that would never stop watching. The Iron Saints didn't become heroes. They didn't become celebrities or activists or symbols of anything larger than what they'd always been. A group of scarred men in a cinderblock garage in a town that the world forgot, doing the only thing they knew how to do, which was stand between danger and the people who couldn't see it coming. No glory, no publicity, no redemption arc with a bow on top, just boots on cold concrete, coffee in cracked mugs, engines idling in the winter dark. And the knowledge carried quietly in every chest and never spoken aloud because speaking it would have diminished it, that the smallest voice in the room had saved them all. And that the debt they owed that voice was not a debt you repay, but a debt you honor every day by listening. And every time the Harleys rumbled through Harlan Falls after that, past the dead mills and the shuttered storefronts, and the single yellow traffic light blinking its eternal, indifferent rhythm, the sound meant something different than it used to. Not warning, not defiance, not the growl of men who had been pushed to the margins and refused to be silent. Something quieter, something that sounded, if you listened carefully enough, like a promise kept.